Representative Frazier? Representative Hale? Representative Marzian? Representative Turner? Senator West?
Here.
We have a quorum.
First matter of business is approval of the minutes from last meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Representative Marzian, I think, made a motion for approval. Is there a second? That objection is so ordered. If you are joining us by video conference, please mute your microphone until it's time for your regulation to be heard. Otherwise, sound interference can occur with the person who is testifying. Please call the first regulation.
I'm going to add to that if you inadvertently leave your mic on, LRC staff might mute it for you. So be sure to take a look and see what's going on with your mic before you testify. Department of Agriculture, Office of the Consumer and Environmental Protection, Industrial Hemp. 302 KAR 50012, 20 with amendment, 30 with amendment, 55 with amendment, and 60 with amendment.
302-50012 repeals two regulations consolidated into other regulations in this package. 302-50020, 030, 055, and 060 revise and reorganize Kentucky's hemp program for the 2020 growing season. The staff suggested amendments to 302-50020, 030, 055, and 060 amend various sections to comply with KRS Chapter 13A.
Would you please identify yourself for the record?
Plank Quarles, counsel for the department.
Thank you. There are staff amendments. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendments? Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Without objection, is so ordered. Are there any questions from members of the subcommittee on this set of regulations? Seeing none, please call the next regulation.
Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, Department of Juvenile Justice. 505 KAR 120 with amendment.
This regulation was amended to define and use the term licensed behavioral health professional and establish consent procedures for medical and behavioral health services. The staff suggested amendment amends Section 1 in the material incorporated by reference to comply with KRS Chapter 13A drafting requirements.
Would you please identify yourself for the record?
Good morning. My name is William Codell. I'm an attorney with the Department of Juvenile Justice.
Thank you. We have a staff amendment. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendment? That objection is so ordered. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Representative Marzian has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, what definition did you use for licensed behavioral health professional? It says define and use the term licensed behavioral health professional.
Certainly, the primary change that we made in this regulation was to move away for qualified mental health professional and substitute that term with licensed behavioral health professional. And my understanding is that licensed behavioral health professional is a term of art that captures a wider scope of people. For example, we can use social workers to provide behavioral health services as opposed to using the term qualified mental health professional limited us to individuals with qualifications in medical background as opposed to social work. Unfortunately, with our current budget circumstances, it was difficult for us to be competitive in offering salaries to people with those types of qualifications using the term qualified mental health professional. So we are amending to licensed behavioral health professional in an effort to have a wider scope of people and a deeper pool of applicants to choose from.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this set of regulations? Seeing none, please call the next regulation.
Education and Workforce Development Cabinet, Board of Education, Department of Education. 702 KAR 6040 with amendment, 702 KAR 6046, and under Department of Technical Education, 780 KAR 1011.
702-6040 is being amended to reflect the repeal of 702-6045. The staff suggested amendment adds a statutory citation. 702-6046 repeals 702-6045 because it has been supplanted by the Federal School Nutrition Employee Training System. 780-1011 repeals 780-1010 because it is no longer in alignment with federal law reauthorized in 2018 under the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act.
Would you please identify yourself for the record?
Good morning, Todd Allen, Interim General Counsel for the State Board of Education and Department of Education.
There's a staff amendment. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendment? Is there a second? We have a motion and second. Without objection, it is so ordered. Any questions from members of the committee on this set of Department of Education regulations? Seeing none, please call the next regulation.
Labor Cabinet, Department of Workplace Standards, 803 KAR 2 301, 304, 311, 312, 315, 316, and 319, all with staff suggested amendments.
These administrative regulations make federal and technical updates to occupational safety and health standards, including general industry, exit routes and emergency planning, fire protection, compressed gas and compressed air equipment, hand and portable power tools and other handheld equipment, welding, cutting, and brazing, and commercial driving operations. The staff suggested amendments amend various sections to comply with KRS Chapter 13A.
Would you please identify yourself for the record?
Good morning, Robin Maples, OSH Standard Specialist with the Cabinet.
Thank you.
And good morning, this is Chuck Stribling, OSH Federal State Coordinator with the Labor Cabinet.
Thank you. We have staff amendments. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendments? Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Without objection, it is so ordered. Do we have any questions for our presenters today on this set of regulations? Moving right along, seeing none, please call the next regulation. Thank you.
Public Protection Cabinet, Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, 810 KAR 2090, an emergency with amendment, 810 KAR 8010 with amendment, 810 KAR 8020, 810 KAR 8030 with amendment, and 8070.
810 KAR 2090 allows use of an alternate facility of a racing association's licensed premises as temporarily unsuitable. 810 KAR 8010, 020, and 030 were amended to update medication rules, withdrawal guidelines, and the penalty structure, including prohibiting the use of Lasix 24 hours before a race for 2-year-old horses in 2020 and stakes horses in 2021, expanding record-keeping requirements, prohibiting the intra-articular use of corticosteroids 14 days before a race, and prohibiting the stacking of multiple corticosteroids. 810-8070 prohibits the use of bisphosphonates in horses under 4 years old and sets standard for their use in horses 4 years old and older. The staff amendments for 2090 and 8010 and 030 amend various sections to correct citations and comply with KRS Chapter 13A. There is also an agency amendment for 810 KAR 8010. It amends Section 2 to establish a threshold for free prednisolone of 10 nanograms per millimeter.
I believe the people we have testifying are here in person. Is that correct? They would come in at this time. While they're coming in, there are staff amendments. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendments? Is there a second? We have a motion. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Without objection, it is so ordered. The staff amendments are approved. There's also an agency amendment. Is there any discussion on the agency amendment? Seeing none, is there a motion for approval of the agency amendment? Is there a second? We have a motion for approval of the agency amendment. Is there a second on that motion? Going once. Going twice. Looking for a second on the motion for approval of the, we have a motion, we have a second. Without objection, it's so ordered. So we have before us the set of regulations discussed from the Horse Racing Commission. We have an approval of the staff amendment, and we also have an approval of the agency amendment. So that's what we have before us. If you could please identify yourselves for the record and then proceed.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wolfing. I'm the General Counsel for the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission.
Mark Guilfoyle, Executive Director, Kentucky Horse Racing Commission.
I'm Dr. Bruce Howard. I'm the Equine Medical Director for the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission.
Chad Thompson, Deputy General Counsel for the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission.
Chauncey Morris, Executive Director, Kentucky Thoroughbred Association.
Thank you. The way I'm going to handle this particular reg is we'll go ahead and hear the presentation. We do have people signed up to speak against. We'll hear their part of the presentation, and then we'll come back for committee questions. So take off.
Also, Senator Webb, we have Dr. Brown and Bob Elliston representing Keeneland on Zoom. We also have Mike Ziegler representing Churchill Downs that would like to speak electronically too, please.
Sure, absolutely. Proceed.
Good morning. The atmosphere surrounding racing in the past year has prompted everyone in the sport to examine many aspects of the sport, from perceived public perception to medication issues to safety issues for the horses, jockeys, and drivers. Today we are addressing several items which will strengthen Kentucky's racing industry by bringing us into alignment with the rest of the racing world and by increasing the safety of racing. Furosemide, or Lasix, is the only medication which is currently permitted to be administered on race day in Kentucky. Permitting the use of furosemide on race day is an issue where the U.S. and Canada are out of alignment with other countries such as United Kingdom, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Japan, and other countries which do not permit the use of furosemide on race day. The proposal today is to eliminate the use of furosemide on race day in 2-year-olds in 2020, which has already begun by a house rule at Churchill Downs, Ellis Park, and Keeneland, and by eliminating the use of furosemide on race day in stakes horses beginning in 2021. As of yesterday, there have been 29 2-year-old races run in Kentucky at Kentucky Downs, Ellis Park, and Keeneland, in which none of the horses received race day furosemide. There were 269 starters in those races, and 0 incidents of epistaxis, or bleeding from the nostrils, observed by our regulatory veterinarians or reported to us by private practitioners. By moving away from the use of race day furosemide, we can come into alignment with the rest of the racing world and help lessen the negative public perception that exists surrounding medication issues in racing. There are many studies which have been done or are currently being done to find ways to lessen the incidence and severity of EIPH in racehorses. Many of these studies have subjective measurements, and both sides of this issue will claim studies which support their arguments. I would like to point out a set of statistics which can help make a comparison between Kentucky's numbers from 2008 to 2018 to the British Horse Racing Authority, which shared these statistics from 2017 through 2019. I believe you have a chart in front of you. The BHA had 175,490 starters in that time period, none of which ran on furosemide, for a 0% furosemide start rate. There were 83 episodes of epistaxis noted for a rate of 0.047%. In Kentucky, 2008 through 2018, there were 189,851 starters, 181,986 of which ran on furosemide, which was a furosemide start rate of 95.9%. There were 106 episodes of epistaxis noted for an incidence rate of 0.056%. So very similar number of starters, very similar numbers of epistaxis and rate of epistaxis, but a furosemide administration rate of 0% in the UK and 95.9% in the U.S. This makes me wonder about the impact that we have on epistaxis by administering furosemide. I know that Kentucky trainers and veterinarians are every bit as talented, intelligent, and capable as those in England. The numbers which we have seen in 2-year-olds racing thus far and the overall comparison, which I just mentioned, makes me believe that we can manage a horse's airway without the use of furosemide on race day. We will have ongoing monitoring of horses which compete without furosemide, and we will report back to the Commission these findings on a regular basis to see if changes need to be made. We will collaborate with other jurisdictions which enact this rule. Our hope is that the rest of the U.S. racing jurisdictions will join with us on the furosemide issue. The other issues on the agenda today will have a positive impact on the safety of racing of the racehorse. These are the 14-day stand-down rule on intra-articular corticosteroid injections and moving the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug administration from 24 hours pre-race out to 48 hours pre-race. The American Association of Equine Practitioners, the largest group of equine practitioners in the world, the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium, all the Kentucky tracks, other industry groups, and other groups around the country have advocated for these changes. Corticosteroids have an anti-inflammatory and analgesic effect in horses, in humans and other animals as well. We as regulatory veterinarians need to be able to evaluate a horse's true state of soundness on race day while performing our exams. We need to see the horse without effects of medications, which may mask lameness, swelling, heat, or joint effusion. Moving the corticosteroid joint injections out 14 days from race day gives us a better chance to truly evaluate a horse's soundness. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs also have inflammatory and analgesic effects. Under the current rule, the horse may receive an NSAID administration 24 hours from post time. Horses are evaluated by our regulatory veterinarians on the morning of race day. It may be at that time only 16 hours from the medication administration. This interval may be as little as 10 hours from administration if it's a night race card. Moving the administration out to 48 hours will give us a better time window to evaluate these horses. It is imperative that we evaluate these horses without medications on board which may mask lameness or injury. For the safety of the horse, we have to be able to see and scratch horses which exhibit lameness and injuries, which put them at a higher risk of catastrophic breakdowns. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jennifer Wolfing. I would like to briefly note that the Equine Drug Research Council, or the ERDC, voted to recommend these regulatory amendments to the
Could you do me a favor and pull that mic a little closer, please?
This one here?
Yeah.
All right. Just for the subcommittee's information, the Equine Drug Research Council, or the EDRC, voted to recommend these regulatory amendments to the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission. Upon that recommendation, the Racing Commission passed these regulatory amendments unanimously in December of 2019.
Any other testimony in favor of the reg from this group or remotely? Please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Chauncey Morris, Kentucky Thoroughbred Association. Chairman West, Chairman Hale. Gentlemen and members of the committee, our association has long been on record of advocating all of these changes. Moreover, this committee would have been communicated with last week that those owners most materially affected by the 2-year-old changes of this reg most recently are in favor of these changes. They believe it's safer for horse racing and moreover, a step in the right direction of meeting the public's expectations of how we race in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. Any other testimony here or remotely in favor?
Dr. Keeneland and Churchill Downs had indicated to me that would be Dr. Stuart Brown and Mike Ziegler that they would like to testify.
Okay. I think I see someone on the screen
That's
now.
Mike Ziegler.
Okay. Mr. Ziegler, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You are
And members of the subcommittee.
teed up and ready to proceed. You can proceed.
All right, thank you. My name is Mike Ziegler. I'm Executive Director of Racing for Churchill Downs Incorporated. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to address you this morning. I want to say the rules that we're discussing today are geared towards saving horse racing as we know it. Our industry needs to do everything that we possibly can to make it safer and increase the integrity of the sport. That is specifically what these rules will do. Lasix is racing's holy war. And you know who wins the holy war? Nobody. That's why we support this Lasix compromise. This compromise, which eliminates the use of Lasix in 2-year-old races this year and moving forward, and eliminates its use in stakes races next year and moving forward. And I use we proverbially, it means Churchill Downs, Keeneland, Turfway Park, Kentucky Downs, Ellis Park, the Red Mile, and Oak Grove Racing. We also means the New York Racing Association and its 3 tracks, the Stronach Group and its 5 tracks, Del Mar, Oak Lawn, Remington, and Lone Star Park. The fact is, tracks representing upwards of 90% of the nation's urban and want this compromise adopted. We feel it's time. We've been talking about Lasix forever. It was controversial when it was introduced, and it remains so today, maybe even more so. This makes me realize that the only solution to this problem is truly a compromise, and that's what's in front of us today. I've learned that when you come to a sticky point between 2 sides, a bad outcome is when one side leaves the table happy and the other side leaves the table disappointed. I feel strongly that what we have in front of us is not that. We have a compromise position that leaves both sides actually less than thrilled. The hay oats and water folks want Lasix completely eliminated. The pro-Lasix people want it completely left alone. This compromise allows young horses that bleed an opportunity to heal with time off, and then they need treatment to race. They'll be able to get it when they turn 3. The compromise also allows the top races to be run free from any race day medications, which is what we believe public really wants. Right now, with these regulations, Kentucky has the opportunity to be the leader in the conversation and hopefully end it. We can move forward together and continue working to continue the momentum that we're seeing in our sport in the Commonwealth right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else ready to testify remotely?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's Stuart Brown, Equine Safety Director at the Keeneland Association over Sales and Racing. I wanted to at least have the opportunity to address this issue, and on behalf of the Keeneland Association, I appear before you to convey our support for these proposed regulations as presented to you for consideration to maintain the Commonwealth's leadership position in one of its signature industries. Keeneland's support for the adoption of these measures is based upon our efforts to ensure the highest standards in place at our facility for the protection and welfare of the equine and human athletes engaged in horse racing. These proposed regulations, as presented to you, have been demonstrated to yield substantial results in improving equine safety through the identification of the at-risk equine athlete and providing the opportunity to intervene in their protection prior to competition. Additionally, the support of these measures by both Keeneland and Churchill Downs represents a commitment made for the engagement of all parties that are aligned in the protection of the racehorse. Our collaborative efforts found within these regulatory changes require the engagement of our horsemen, private equine veterinarians, regulatory veterinarians, stewards, and track management to accomplish the alignment we seek for the benefit of safety of all horses and riders. Prior to accepting my current role as Equine Safety Director at Keeneland, I recently completed a term of service as a commissioner on the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, where I was chairman of its Equine Drug Research Council, a significant advisory body to our commission focused on the areas of safety and integrity of racing in the Commonwealth. The EDRC was established through statute for this purpose and contains a diverse representation of non-members that are appointed from across various sectors of the racing industry in the state. Approximately 1 year ago at an EDRC meeting, Mr. Mike Ziegler, who serves on the EDRC as its representative from racetracks, made an announcement of this effort led by CDI and Keeneland with the support of every other racetrack ownership interest in the Commonwealth, To address the challenges facing the racing industry at that time around safety of the equine athlete and the integrity of the sport of horse racing. As you will recall, that time coincided with a national concern over the incidence rate of catastrophic injuries in our sport. One of those items most thoroughly discussed and debated over two of these EDRC meetings last year was on the proposed approach for LASIK administration on race day. There is no more contentious area of interest in North American racing that can be found than on this issue. The proposed phase-down approach that rests in the regulatory changes proposed today would restrict the use of the medication on race day in all 2-year-old racing in 2020, and further would include all states competition in 2021, those races that are at the highest level of competition in our sport. The agreement reached from these EDRC meetings and then approved by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission represents the balance of viewpoints distilled from the perspectives of stakeholders, both in support of and opposed to the administration of LASIKs to horses on race day. It represents an approach that will assist veterinarians in understanding the true incidence rate of the condition of EIPH or bleeding in 2-year-old racing at the beginning of their careers, while allowing the support of horses in their 3-year-old careers and beyond, identified with EIPH, that may be needed to ameliorate their symptoms and support their respiratory health while in training and in competition. I would also note that at our recent 5-day meet at Keeneland, we have had the opportunity with 2-year-old races there to actually engage and work with the private practitioners there to talk about what they were seeing in terms of incidence rate in those runners, and we happily to report there was a low incidence rate noted by many of those private practitioners that were participating on the grounds. Having participated in many national racing debates over this issue that have ended in gridlock, I applaud the fortitude of the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission to lead with a progressive approach on this contentious matter. In summary, Keeneland stands in support of these proposed regulations to advance our efforts that allow us to protect the welfare of our equine and human athletes participating in horse racing at our facility, our highest priority for our stakeholders, and as a model for others to follow. As both a leader in the racing industry and the largest thoroughbred auction house of international bloodstock, these regulatory changes will help us in efforts to ensure our industry position in alignment with international standards governing the sport of horse racing. These decisions come at a critical time when those goals are of greatest importance to the future of our sport as a global industry. Thank you for your time and consideration today.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other guests testifying in favor? Seeing none. At this time, we have, if you could step back for just a moment, we have some people here to testify against. I'll wait for them to come forward. Whenever you're ready, if you would identify yourself for the record.
Mr. Chairman, I am Rick Hiles. I'm the president of the Kentucky Horsemen's Protective Association. I'm also the vice president of the National Association of Horsemen. We're here today to speak against this because, for one, I'm going to speak to you from the heart as being an owner and trainer for 48 years of what I've seen progress through the years with the advent of LASIKs. I was here when we didn't have the LASIKs, and I raced without it, and I know what we have to do to horses to keep them from bleeding. And regardless of what they tell you, that they've had all these horses run this year without LASIKs, and none of them they've seen them bleed, it's because they're only checking the winner and maybe one other horse out of the race, and they're looking for them to bleed externally. Most horses don't bleed externally, they bleed internally. It's scientific data will tell you that upwards of 83% of all horses raced bleed to some extent. Some horses can go through bleeding a little bit and some can't. There is nothing that's more unsafe for an animal to be running in a race and starting to bleed, and it gets in his trachea and he starts choking and he starts losing air. As you know, oxygen transfers to the muscles. The muscles start getting fatigued. When this happens, the horses start getting down. And can you imagine a horse running like that and starting to choke, and then some little man on his back with a stick beating him, trying to make him go. Now, if that is not unsafe, nothing is, because there's a chance that horse may go down and cause a pileup in a race, maybe hurt other animals or even the jockeys, number one. Number two, most horses, they don't have any evidence of bleeding until maybe an hour after the race when they endoscope them. They have not endoscoped any of the horses to see if they've bled internally, okay? And most of them go back to their private barns, and then an hour later when they drop their heads to start eating hay or cool down, then the blood comes out externally. So they're not seeing all that. Now, there was a survey done down in Florida a couple years ago by Dr. Stephen Selway, which is a renowned veterinarian in the Florida circuit and the New Jersey circuit. They tried to run 2-year-olds without Lasix 2 years ago. He scoped every horse just to see what the effects would be. And here's what he writes, and I've got a copy to give to you too. He says, does it contribute to breakdowns given horse Lasix? The literature is clear on this. There is no association with breakdowns. To the contrary, fatigue has been clearly shown to be associated with athletic injury, and EPIH causes fatigue. It interferes with drug testing. The literature is clear on this also. No effect on drug testing at 4 hours. Also, our lab technician, Dr. Sams, testified before the Racing Commission that this will not mask any other drugs, that they have no problem testing with it. And is it performance enhancing? No, it's not. It's performance enabling. It enables a horse to run to his potential because he can breathe. Now, I've got some letters here also to give to you from 2 prominent owners that had enough backbone to stand up and say what most owners are feeling, that they will reduce the size of their stable if this takes effect, because they're not going to breed horses and race horses and knowing that if they bleed. Can you imagine going to the sale and trying to purchase a yearling or trying to purchase a 2-year-old in training, knowing that the propensity for this horse to bleed may be there, and if you can't give him a medication to stop this, you put him in training, pay all this money, and the trainer calls you and says, look, your horse is bleeding. We can't stop him. You're going to have to take him home. Now, you think that man is going to say, okay, put him out on the farm, we'll go back and buy another one. It's not going to happen. This is the beginning of the end of horse racing in the state of Kentucky, which is our signature industry. Now, they want to do 2-year-olds this year, stake horses next year, and then all horses the year after. Believe me, when you get into these older horses that have already bled, when they burst a vein and bleed once, the analogy I like to use is like, some of you are not as old as me, but we used to have all of our tires on our cars had inner tubes in them. You get a puncture in inner tube, you put a patch on it. It was never as strong as that new inner tube. Once these babies burst these veins and they get weak, a weak area, their propensity to bleed again is more significant. And the more they do it, it's going to ruin them. So we're here to speak against this. And on the 24-hour NSAIDs, the analogy I like to use is that we used to have therapeutic medications on race day. We backed up to 24 hours back. Now that's like you taking 2 Motrins today so you can compete tomorrow. And now they're wanting to say 48 hours out. And I remember testifying before this committee once before, and there was a gentleman who was in here, and he said, you mean I can't take 2 Motrins the day before I play golf? And I said, that's what this reg is saying. He said, well, I can't play golf without taking 2 Motrins. So this is what's happening. They're destroying the industry. If you go back in the 80s and 90s, when we had race day medications, the catastrophic breakdown rate was much less then than it is now. So we're opposed to doing away with Lasix. And there's one other thing I would like to say to this committee. You people set rules and regulations for the Racing Commission to go by. And it's an administrative regulation. And the state agency is supposed to go by those. At this time, while we're talking, the Racing Commission and the racetracks have decided to ignore these regulations. They're doing things now that is not authorized under the current regulations. They're already doing what they're asking you to change now. And so if that's going to be the case, that the Racing Commission is going to delegate their authority to a private entrepreneurship to set rules and regulations, then there's no point in having a Racing Commission. And that's what they've done this year by allowing the racetracks just to say, this is what we're going to do. Next year, the racetracks may say, well, we want to run certain days. We'll just run whenever we want to run. So if they're not going to abide by what the state sets, there's no point in that. Now, I've got an Attorney General's opinion here with me that says they cannot do what they're doing right now. We have informed them of this, and they've done it anyway. So there's a lot of things in the make. This LASIK issue has been a hot debate for a long, long time. I served on the Equine Drug Council myself for many, many years. And we were told at the time, when they wanted to take the private practicing veterinarians away from giving LASIKs and let the regulatory vets do it, they done it because they said it's a public perception. And I argued then, you go in the grandstand where all the fans are and ask them, does it make you any difference which veterinarian gives LASIKs to a horse? And I guarantee you, 98% will say no. But they told us at the time that we had to do this to save LASIKs for our animals. So we compromised and did it to save the LASIKs for the animal. And I objected at the time saying, you're telling me I have to let a strange person come in my barn, stick a needle in my horse, somebody that I don't even know, and give him some medication, which I don't even know for sure what they're giving. But we did it to save LASIKs. And now they're coming back and saying, not only are they saying they want to do away with LASIKs, they're also going back now with this reg and saying that the private practicing veterinarians can now give LASIKs again. So if it was a public perception then, how is it not a public perception now? So with me, I've got my national attorney for our National Horseman, and he's got some things he'd like to say. This is Pete Eckebert.
Yeah, my name is Peter Eckebert. I'm the General Counsel for the National HPPA. The National HPPA is composed of owners and trainers.
Sir, could you pull that, these masks make it a little bit more difficult. Could you pull that mic there?
They do, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, is that better?
It's better, yes, thank you.
Like I said, the National HPPA is composed of thoroughbred owners and trainers, and we have approximately 30,000 members. The Kentucky membership numbers of approximately 6,000. So we represent the folks on the front line with horse racing. And what I'd like to do is sort of explain why we oppose this regulation that would prohibit the use of LASIKs, because we feel that LASIKs does have so many therapeutic benefits that outweigh any perception that some people may have. I have a written statement that I'd like to provide to the membership, and I'll just go through and sort of go through some of the highlights of that statement, but I have it here for distribution to you all. I'd just like to say that LASIKs, like has been said, prevents and mitigates pulmonary hemorrhaging, which is bleeding in the lungs during racing, and it's necessary to keep a horse healthy and reduce the risk of injury to the horse and the jockey. LASIK's use is not doping. No one can reasonably conclude otherwise. Its use is safe and has been routinely administered by veterinarians for the past 40 years in the treatment of horses. Moreover, it's transparent to the public. In the racing programs, there's an L next to the horse where LASIKs is being used. So there's no secret or anything going on. It's not like in the past, like Mr. House testified that where they withheld water from the horse before a race so that it would allow them to go in with the same effects of this diuretic that LASIKs does. We support the continued use of LASIKs on race day because the weight of the scientific studies supports its use to prevent the occurrence of EIPH, which is the exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhaging. And we further state that it makes sense to allow this. The science says that to allow it on race day is the most effective time for the administration of LASIKs, 4 hours prior to a race. The reason seems common sense. I'm not a scientist, but it seems to be common sense to allow the administration before a race because the horse is about to experience some extreme physical stress during the race, which causes nearly all horses to bleed. While you don't necessarily, it's unusual for a horse to bleed out its nose, all horses bleed to some extent during the race, which has been established, and I have the site in the written statement to the scientists, that the study that was done that establishes that. And further, that the bleeding is primarily internal, but it's, as Mr. Hiles mentioned, it's progressive. So once you have the internal bleeding, that damages the lungs, and then it's a continued situation that just gets worse as the horse continues to bleed. As it's mentioned here, that the European standard or the world standard is not to use Lasix on race day, but they do train with Lasix throughout the daily training of the horse. So it seems that to use it on race day is when it's the most effective, makes the most sense. There's no objection to using it in those other jurisdictions during other times except on race day. Further, the United States is the primary thoroughbred industry with respect to any place else in the world, so that and Kentucky is the gold standard. We feel that to do something now that would adversely impact on horse racing would be just catastrophic to the industry, and something we don't need at this stage. There's been no evidence to show that Lasix had anything to do with the breakdowns that have occurred in 2019 in Santa Anita, but it's been painted with a broad brush as if this were a primary issue and one of the reasons for it. We again would ask you to consider all these arguments, as well as I've attached a letter from Chester Thomas, who's a horse owner and whose has a stable of racehorses from Madisonville, Kentucky, and he's not a scientist, but he brings forth how this is going to destroy the industry in ordinary common sense type terms that often we don't hear too much of, but he puts forth an excellent letter, and I've attached it, so I hope you'll consider that as well. Again, those are the reasons that National HPPA supports the continued use of Lasix, and we hope that you'll be able to see that this is a viable and the best situation for the horse, and to allow it to continue, and not to allow this proposed regulation to be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Dr. Clara Finger. I'm a veterinary specialist in internal medicine. Been practicing for over 30 years. I'm an active scientist and researcher in the field of exercise physiology and pharmacology in racehorses. And I'm also a racehorse owner and breeder. I'm also the secretary of the North American Association of Racetrack Veterinarians, which represents almost all of the private racetrack practitioners in the state of Kentucky. The first comment that I want to make is the bringing into alignment, the argument that this regulation will bring us into alignment with the rest of the world. And to underscore a comment made by Mr. Eckbert, we are the largest and most influential industry, racehorse industry for thoroughbreds and quarter horses in the world. For us to come into alignment with them is a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. So I would disregard that argument, because we're it. We're the ones who set the standard, not Europe, not the Far East. So I'm going to start with that. My next comment is, this is a direct quote from Dr. Thomas Frieden, the former director of the CDC. Let the science drive the policy making. This is in reference to the coronavirus, but it is equally applicable here, because this regulation does not permit the science to drive the policy making. And in a follow-up response to his comment, someone stated, the real deadly mistake is not listening to the science. And those are equally applicable in this circumstance. The reason, and God bless them, they're trying. Just like, do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? You know, do we social distance? Do we not social distance? It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. We put forth regulations in order to combat a serious problem. And we're facing this down with coronavirus right now. But we've been facing it down in the last few years in horse racing as well. These new medication regulations proposed by the KHRC are in direct reflection of the severe and fatal injuries that have been garnering national attention across the country. Predominantly at Santa Anita, although we all noticed that Churchill Downs has not been ignored in this, or Keeneland have both had their spikes of high rates of injury. So there's a knee-jerk reaction to do something, anything, something to mitigate these serious injuries. And these regulations were thrown up there as almost like a smokescreen. Oh God, let's throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. These regulations are currently in place in California. I don't know if anyone's paid attention to the news, but California is not escaping scrutiny because of breakdowns. Santa Anita had breakdowns. Santa Anita had as many breakdowns as they did last year before these regulations were put in place. What they did successfully do is move those breakdowns from their main track surface, which they worked on and worked on and worked on to make safer, and instead they had these problems on their turf course. So clearly, the changes made to the surface of the racetrack made a difference on the injuries, but the medication rules did not. And potentially, all of the benefits that they had by their changes in the track surface, potentially these medication rules actually made it worse. Why would I suggest that they would make it worse? Well, first of all, EIPH causes fatigue. And it's a well-known, established fact in exercise science that fatigue, it is when you become fatigued that you suffer the most injury. And if you are bleeding in the lungs during high exercise, high-intensity exercise, you're more likely to experience fatigue. So to rebut some of the comments that were made by our colleagues on the Racing Commission, there was a lot of focus on epistaxis, or bleeding from the nose. And as Mr. Howes has pointed out, the majority of bleeding does not come out the nose. There's a couple reasons for that. A lot of it is that the horse brings it up into their pharynx, they swallow it. So a horse could bleed a lot, and you could never see any from the nose, because that horse likes to swallow it more, whereas the next horse would rather snort it out his nose. So it's almost a personal preference on the part of the horse. In fact, most horses that die, meaning drop dead because they bled so much into their lungs that they drowned, do not have epistaxis. What you have is a dead horse on the racetrack. So, and we don't know that they died of EIPH until after we do a necropsy and go, oh, look, he drowned in his own blood. He didn't have time to cough it up and snort it out his nose. That is the exact opposite of what the purpose of these new medication rules is. The purpose of the new medication rules is to decrease the number of injuries. And instead, in particular, the EIPH ban is more likely to increase the number of injuries. Now, I'm going to go back to the science comment. Follow the science. Policy making should be based on science. Well, we have, as a part of these regulations, we have stacking regulations. If you have more than one corticosteroid in your system, that's a violation. But they don't have any actual guidance as to what that is going to be. And when Mary Scalay, the current executive director of the RMTC and previous equine medical director here in Kentucky, testified at the RCI meeting where these regulations were adopted in December, she said, well, we don't really know what the thresholds are. That science has not been done. Well, how can you make policy when the science has not actually been done yet? And this is from the words of one of our regulators, This is from her own mouth, and we don't actually have that information. So the current set of regulations has taken with it a lot of errors in that the thresholds do not account for environmental contamination. As an example, the lidocaine positives, if anyone has paid attention to the news, Bob Baffert had a couple of high-profile lidocaine positives in Arkansas. Do you know that the levels of lidocaine in his horse were lower than the amount of lidocaine you can find in some streams in the southeastern United States? Meaning the amount of lidocaine that's present in the stream. So you could potentially have horses violate the stacking regulations according to this regulation and have never been administered the drug because they picked it up from an environmental standpoint. So there's a number of scientific pharmacologic issues that need to be addressed, that must be addressed before anything like this can be put into effect. And then a rebuttal to Mr. Ziegler. He claims that these rules are in effect in some huge percentage of the racetracks across the country. In Maryland, they are currently carting no 2-year-old races because the horsemen won't enter without Lasix, and the racetrack won't take an entry with Lasix. So they're simply not riding any 2-year-old races. So the state rules in most states outweigh the House rules. So his argument that that's not being done is not entirely correct. In Florida, the regulations are determined at the legislative level, and these rules for the 24-hour Lasix in 2-year-olds have not gone into place in Florida. So while the racetrack says you cannot give Lasix at 4 hours on our racetrack at Gulfstream Park, in fact, the state or the state laboratory is still regulating it at the same levels as if they were being given Lasix at 4 hours. So the argument that these are already in place in other places, it's working, so we should just join in, is false. And Dr. Brown's comments about these rules have been demonstrated to protect the equine athlete, I would argue that the facts in California where horses are breaking down in the face of these regulations argue against his contention. And you should all have a copy of my statements because I sent them out before.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add one thing. All the scientific data that's ever been done on this proves what a valuable therapeutic medication this is. There is no scientific data to prove that it is not good. Also, there are many human beings that live on this medication on a daily basis that couldn't live without it. So for the health and welfare of these animals, we're asking this committee to not put this into effect. I fool with horses every day. I've done it all my life, and the health and welfare of that animal has to come first. So we ask that you really look at this in depth before you make a decision on these. And also that you would find out why that the current administrative regulations are not being abided by right now. We have a court case, ongoing court case right now that we've objected to this in the court system.
Okay, is that it with this? You can stay right there for now. The way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to ask the committee if they have any questions for this group, and then after those questions are over, we'll bring the first group back up and ask if they, give them a chance to rebut, ask them if there's any questions for that group. So at this time, Senator Thomas, I believe, has a question. If staff could help him with that microphone, I'm not sure.
Testing.
Apparently, you could just hit mute and it should unmute it.
Okay.
There you go.
Is it Mr. Eckelberg, the attorney? I have one question, Mr. Eckelberg. Is it Dr. Hiles?
No, it's Rick Hiles.
Mr. Hiles, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
My question to you first, Mr. Eckelberg, as the attorney. Okay. I'm an ardent follower of thoroughbred racing. And when I hear testimony to the fact that what this drug is performance enhancing as opposed to being performance enabling, isn't that really just a war of semantics? If I don't feel well in performing and I take a drug and somehow I'm unable to perform, doesn't that actually enhance my performance? And don't we want to get away from drugs that really give someone a benefit or an advantage that they might not otherwise have in performance? Doesn't that somehow give the impressions of cheating or being dishonest?
May I answer that?
Well, Mr. Eckelberg first.
He's an attorney, I'm a horseman.
Well, I would say it's sparsing words, but it is not performance enhancing, because what it's doing is allowing the horse to reach its potential, its own inherent potential. Because what this does is it prevents a condition. It's like if you take high blood pressure medicine, it allows you to go out and do things that you wouldn't if you didn't take it, and you had a massive heart attack. Obviously, that would stop you from exercising and doing anything else. This allows a horse to be able to do what it naturally does. It doesn't make its abilities any greater. It doesn't increase it. It just allows it to perform as it under its own abilities.
Okay. Yes, it's not a performance enhancer. You said if you felt bad and you take a drug, it allows you to go out and do that. The horses don't feel bad. It's in the race while the spirit of competition is going on that this blood pressure builds up, and it happens. And the Lasix helps reduce that, okay? Now, Lasix is a diuretic, and so they want to give Lasix 24 hours out. So you have a couple options here. You either make a horse go without water for 24 hours, which you know yourself is inhumane, or if you give them water inside that 24-hour period, then you're defeating the purpose of giving them Lasix, because they're going to rehydrate themselves again. So it's not that they feel bad, it's just we're trying to prevent something from happening. If you had a heart problem, as Mr. Eckelberg said, and you could take medication that you know would prevent you from having a massive heart attack, even though you felt fine, wouldn't you want to take it? Rather than risk of not taking it and having a heart attack.
May I weigh in?
Mr. I have one more question for you. And tell me your name, ma'am.
Dr. Clara Finger.
Finger?
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Finger. And I've got one question for you. And you probably won't appreciate my comments here, but you feel free to respond.
That's fine.
It seems to me that your statement, which says that Kentucky somehow is a leader and we should be setting the standard and not comply with what's going on in the rest of the world, in Britain and Saudi Arabia and other countries, seems to me that kind of borders on what people tend to think of as American arrogance, that somehow we're better than everyone else and we shouldn't be doing what the rest of the world is doing. The information that was provided to me, by Keeneland and by Churchill Downs and by Mr. Morris, who's the executive director of the Kentucky Thoroughbred Association, seems to say that what the other nations in the world are doing is certainly working, and they haven't had any problem with epitaxis as a result of not allowing horses to use Lasix on racing day. I just don't see why we shouldn't be in compliance with the rest of the world in terms of doing what they're doing. That we should have this arrogance or haughty attitude that somehow we're better than everybody else. So if you could elaborate on that, please, I'd appreciate it. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but that's the way your certain statement sounded. It sounded rather arrogant.
I would love to comment on that. Briefly, I am going to comment real briefly on the previous statement or question, and that is, I was part of the study that was done in Florida where almost every 2-year-old that raced without Lasix was scoped, and many of those horses were scoped with Lasix and without Lasix, and a small number of those horses did not bleed or had a grade 1, which is considered meaningless or irrelevant. so grade 1 or a 0. And of the horses that had a grade 1 or 0 and raced with and without Lasix, there was no difference in the performance. In fact, there was a non-statistical better performance in those horses without significant bleeding. There was an insignificant improvement in performance without Lasix. So no Lasix, actually they performed better. The problem is it was such a small percentage because most horses after several races did start to bleed. And so, I mean, if they want to put this rule in and horses in their first start as 2-year-olds, I could support it. But to require horses after multiple starts to not have the opportunity to have Lasix that's inhumane. As far as the second comment about American arrogance, European racing is almost exclusively populated by owners that go by Her Royal Highness or the Aga Khan or Sheikh something or another. In this country, racing is a sport of the common man. And that has actually allowed us to become actually the strongest jurisdiction in the world because we don't restrict racing to a tiny upper echelon of the people. We actually have a very solid and strong middle income horse ownership. And that is something that will essentially disappear when you have to buy 5 horses in order for only one of them to make it to the races. And the more you restrict therapeutic medications, the more that is going to happen. Lasix is like a seatbelt. You didn't need it unless you got into a wreck. Most of us don't need it for our entire lives. But the limited evidence that we have, which is only 2 studies that even look at performance and Lasix, do not support that Lasix in and of itself in a horse, separate from bleeding, enhances performance.
Senator Thomas, let me add something to that. The testing protocols in Europe and England are not the same as we have in this country. They do not test like we do here. We test stringently here. If you would notice, being a horse racing fan that you are, when they bring the horses here to run in the Breeders' Cup and other races, the Kentucky Derby, the first thing they do is they give them Lasix. Their performance does not increase. So that tells you that they've been doing something over there similar to that, okay? Now, I'll give you a fine example. I had a pharmacologist, scientific research guy, told me himself, he went to England, and he was in the testing labs in England, and he was talking to the guy that runs the labs. He said, you know, I noticed here that you never have a positive for phenylbutazolone, which is bute. And he said, yeah, we don't have any positives over here for it. And he said, well, I don't understand this. Y'all don't run on bute? He said, yeah, we run on bute. We just don't test for it. So people misconstrue what's going on in Europe and other places as opposed to what's going on here. We test 99.5% of all trainers and horses that run last year were clean, but they're tested regularly. Their protocols are not the same as ours, okay? So when they come over here, their performance, you won't see it improve because they give them Lasix or they give them bute or things like that. So keep that in mind too.
Any other questions from other members of the committee? Representative Marzian.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I guess for Dr. Finger, you talked a little bit about Santa Anita and all the problems they've had there. And so they're off Lasix, is that correct?
In 2-year-olds.
In 2-year-olds. So is it basically just the surface of the track, or have there been other issues?
They have made more changes than you can possibly count in order to try to address this. And like I said, good on them that they're doing that. To me, and as the people that I represent, the more you restrict therapeutic, we're not talking about illegal medications, we're not talking about the federal indictment kind of drugs. We're talking about legal therapeutic medications. You go to your doctor Your doctor gives you a prescription. The more they restrict therapeutic medications, the more you are pulling the horsemen away from their own veterinarians, who are the ones who are most able to determine if that horse is fit to race. The regulatory veterinarian, as they pointed out, they get to see him on race day. And in some cases, you've got someone trying to hide the lameness or whatever's wrong with the horse from them. Whereas as the veterinarian for the horse, my job is to take care of it and to know the whole history. And the more you restrict therapeutic medications, they're not going to call me within 2 weeks. They're not going to call me to look within 2 weeks. Why? Because I can't do anything within 2 weeks. But if I'm there within 2 weeks, I have the opportunity to say, you shouldn't race, we can't race this horse because I intervened. That's not the problem. The problem is more serious and we need to not race. But I don't even have that opportunity. One example that I can tell you is joint injury or joint disease. That's like just chronic wear and tear. I'm an athlete. That's what we inject them for. That's why it's a fairly common procedure. That does not cause breakdowns. What causes breakdowns is stress fractures. And if I see a horse that's slightly off or just isn't training like he's supposed to, and I say, well, I think maybe it's the synovitis in that right front ankle, let's inject it. I inject it, and the horse doesn't go sound or it doesn't change its training behavior. Now, we might have a stress fracture, and we really have to pursue this because a stress fracture does predispose to breakdown or serious injury. If I take the same horse, a horse with a stress fracture, if I walk that horse, meaning I don't send it to the racetrack for 2 weeks, that horse will be dead sound on race day. It'll be sound for me, it'll be sound for him, it'll be sound for the spectators, it'll be sound for the people on TV watching it warm up. But it still has a stress fracture. And that is why the more you restrict therapeutic medications, the more danger you're going to put these athletes in.
Thank you. Can I have one follow-up question too?
Quick follow-up, if you would, please.
So Lasix is mainly used as therapeutic to protect the horse, but not enhance the horse.
Exactly.
So is Lasix, can that be given during training? Routinely, and then if you withhold it?
So from the exercise scientist viewpoint, when you're training, you don't want to reach maximal, because maximal effort is one tick away from super maximal, which is where you get injuries or severe problems. So you want to compete at maximal, and anyone that's ever done serious competition, like even in high school, will remember this. You want to train to 80%. You want to train to something shy of 100% max, but you want to compete at max. Because 80% will get you to where you're training your muscles, your lungs, everything part of your system, so that you are capable then of adding that extra 20% and competing at maximal. So the reason why we are supporting Lasix on race day is a lot of horses then don't have to have the repeated Lasix administration during their workout. However, once a horse starts to bleed, once you've done that maximal, you've gone over the line, you've damaged the blood supply to the lungs, now you got to train them on Lasix. Every time you go and for anything fast, you got to put them on Lasix. And that is commonly done. That is commonly done in Europe and other countries. Lasix is given to a lot of horses, if not most of them, for that supposed 80% workout. But we would rather work them shy of that injury point,
right,
and not then have to put them on Lasix during training. But yes, there's lots of horses on Lasix in training.
Oh, thank you.
Let me respond a little bit more further to her. I was around Representative Merzen when there was no Lasix. I know what we had to do to horses to try to prevent them from bleeding, and I saw much more horses bleeding then than now. This therapeutic medication was developed through scientific research for the benefit and the health of the horse. If I told you that there's a good human medicine out there that we've got now that really works good on people, but we were going to take it away because somebody wanted to. Just people that don't own horses or don't pay any bills don't want to take this away. They don't think it's good. That would be like me going down to Jewish Hospital in Louisville, put me on the board to make decisions for the doctors, what the medicines they could give their patients. These things have been drawn up without private practicing veterinarians and horsemen involved into them. They need to listen to the people that know, that got the data to do this.
And a comment, which is actually.
This will have to be the final comment in this section.
I'm
'cause
sorry.
We got many, many regulations behind you guys.
The comment in response to Dr. Woolsing that she said that or not Dr., the attorney, she said that the EDRC committee passed this. The only two practitioners who actually treat horses actually on the racetrack that are on that committee voted against it.
Interesting, thank you.
If you could stay there one moment. My co-chairman made me a liar here. I'm going to allow him a question because of my respect for him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and thank you all, and I'll be very brief. I do, Dr. Fingler, is that correct?
Finger.
Okay. I do agree with the statement that you made earlier, that I think in America, we ought to be setting the standard. I mean, for the industry that we have right now, I agree certainly with that statement. And I guess maybe I have more of a comment than a statement. We all know that there's been a huge black eye on the racing industry in the last few years, 2 or 3 years especially. We all realize that. And it, as has been stated by both parties, this is such a signature industry to our state here in Kentucky. And I'll be the first to sit here and admit I'm kind of naive to some of the things that's even being said here today as far as the testimony, not having a full understanding of the drug, the way it exactly works or what it exactly does. But one thing that I would like to add, and I just say this very candidly, I'm not exactly sure why we wouldn't be attempting to do everything to ensure the safety of these animals. I feel like that any step backward here, any step back is we are not ensuring the safety of these beautiful animals that we have here, especially in this state, right here in Kentucky. And I certainly think that we in Kentucky, we don't want to see what has happened in California and some of the other tracks, some of the numerous tragedies have happened. And I guess mainly it was more of a comment than a question, but just, if she could just respond 30 seconds to that, Senator. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Number one, these medication rules have not shown any evidence of fixing the problems in California, number one. Number two, as I mentioned before in the quote, let the science drive the policymaking. And what we need is more evidence on why these regulations would make those changes that they're saying. For sure, 100% of the scientists agree that the LASIX regulation won't make racing 1 iota safer and may actually make it more dangerous. The other regulations, we simply don't have the science to enforce the thresholds, and it does, as I explained to Representative Martin, it does put forth the risk that I am going to be unable to properly diagnose horses, which puts us all out in no man's land as far as safety of horses. The science isn't there, and therefore the policy should not be made.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for enduring me in that question.
Thank you. If the first group would come back up at this time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. What we're going to do is, rather than allow you guys to make a statement, I'm just going to jump. We have a lot of regulations after this segment, so I'm just going to let members of the committee ask you all questions, and then you can chime in and try to respond to some of the stuff that was said earlier prior, if that's okay with you. Is that fine?
I would like, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, clarify one thing.
That's fine.
That was said up here.
We'll do that real quickly, and then we'll jump in.
They were talking about that we were putting forth things and regulations that did not exist. That's not true.
Could you hold on 1 second on that note? I think what you're referring to, I'm the only one that received a copy. This is what Mr. Hiles was describing, the Attorney General's opinion from 2015, where it says, the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission may not promulgate regulations delegating the authority to determine whether or not LASIX-free races, to hold LASIX-free races to private racetracks. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, there is
I'll have this distributed to all members of the committee.
There is a regulation in place that was passed in 2015. It's 810 KAR 8:050. It's called the International Racing Protocol, and that's what is happening now. So I just wanted to be clear that we're not just out doing things without a regulation to back us up, because if that was the case, then this wouldn't be happening, because somebody could claim foul right off the bat, take us to court, and try to get that beat. But we are following regulation that is on the books, has been on the books since 2015. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Any members have questions for this group? If I don't see any questions, we've saved a little time there. So if you would, if you need a couple minutes to respond, just a couple minutes to what the prior group had stated.
Sure. As has been discussed, and as I said in my opening statement, that there are studies which are going to be claimed by both sides of this issue to back up their statements. There are published scientific studies which have questioned the efficacy of LASIX in reducing EIPH. There's no question that EIPH is problematic in the racehorse, but one of the prominent studies that was done realizes that and questions the use of the efficacy of LASIX for this treatment. And I, again, would go back to the numbers of the comparison that we had between the BHA and the Kentucky numbers for those time periods, that we had the same epistaxis rate. And I realize epistaxis is the most severe form of bleeding, but I would think that it would translate into all of the subjective grades, the 0s, 1s, and 2s. These are published studies. One of the studies cited is a non-peer-reviewed, non-published study. We're not asking to remove LASIX as a training tool. In Europe, it is used in training. In the U.S., it is used in training. The restriction that we are asking for is for within 24 hours of a race start that LASIX is to be restricted. As far as guidelines for thresholds, some of the thresholds are based on studies done by the RMTC. Some of the thresholds are established because of guidelines put out by the European Horse Race Scientific Liaison Committee. But all of the thresholds do have science behind them that we have established the current thresholds. Thank you.
I have a question at this time. Of course, one of the most important things we discuss in this committee is process. And if you could go briefly into, we want to make sure we're in the legislature, but we're also laymen when it comes to the science behind LASIX and the intricacies of that. Could you go into the process that occurred as far as public comment, back and forth at the Horse Racing Commission, and did you feel that everybody had a chance to be heard on this subject?
These regulations were approved unanimously by the Racing Commission in December of 2019. And we did open up these regulations for public notice and comment. We actually received quite a few public notices, or quite a few comments at our public hearing, which was held on Wednesday, April the 22nd. We actually held our public hearing via Zoom. We had some great participation. We also received a number of written comments afterwards, and we provided a statement of consideration relating to those comments. The vast majority of the comments were related to 810 KAR 8:010, which is the regulation that seems to be the most interesting to people today. It includes the concerns that were raised about LASIX as well as NSAIDs and steroids. So we did go through the full process, and everyone had a full and fair opportunity to make their concerns known.
Thank you. Does any other member of the committee have questions for this group? Seeing none, at this time, do we have any motions or anything of that nature concerning this regulation from any member of the committee? Seeing none, one point I'd like to clarify is that the purpose of this committee is first and foremost to review process. And there is another bite at the apple, as this will go to the Committee of Jurisdiction after this. So that would be licensing and occupations, I'm assuming, L&O. But having said that, Representative Marzian has a question.
Thank you so much. So my understanding is that LASIK is used during training, but this would prohibit use at race day, which the other group says is used for safety, not to enhance the race. Is that correct?
Representative Marzian, not on all horses. So what we're talking about here is on 2-year-olds and stakes races. Those are two separate populations. For allowance races, acclaiming races, and including training, you are still able to use LASIKs.
So why not on 2-year-olds?
I'll answer that. Young horses show less propensity for epistaxis or EIPH. The numbers that we have obtained through the EID for the last 11 years that I cited show very, very low incidence of 2-year-olds that have bled either with LASIK or without. It's a start. This is the start that we want to look at, the effects that we have of racing without LASIK, compare it to other jurisdictions and compare it to other countries. There are stakes races which have been run in the U.S. within the past year that have been LASIK free. Again, no evidence of epistaxis, different grades that have been reported with endoscopic exams, but that horses have raced successfully in these stakes races. So this is the beginning for us to look at our ability to conduct races without the use of furosemide on race day.
I guess I have a concern that if it hurts our racing industry, as these folks have said, that we're already in trouble with the coronavirus and very few races. And sometimes I've been to Churchill and there's been 5 horses in a race. So that is a concern that it could damage our industry.
Well, again, I'd like to point out the numbers of the 29 races that we've run in Kentucky thus far. It has been successful, the 2-year-olds competing without LASIK. They've been very full fields, an average of over, I believe it's 9.7 horses per field, so it hasn't limited our field size.
Thank you. Any motions by any members at this time? Seeing none, please call the next regulation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cabinet for Health and Family Services, Department for Community-Based Services, Division of Family Support. 921 KAR 3025 in emergency with amendment.
This regulation amends to no longer disqualify non-custodial parents from SNAP if the parent is in arrears on court-ordered child support. The staff suggested amendment amends various sections to correct citations and to comply with KRS Chapter 13A.
Would you please identify yourself for the record?
Good morning. My name is Laura Began. I'm the Regulation Coordinator for the Department for Community-Based Services.
And good morning. I'm Elizabeth Kaywood. I'm the Deputy Commissioner with the Department for Community-Based Services.
And joining us virtually, we also have Jason Dunn, the Director of the Division for Family Support, DCGS.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a staff amendment on this one. Is there a motion for approval of the staff amendment? There's a motion. Do we have a second? Without objection, it is so ordered. Do we have any questions from members of the committee on this set of regulations? Seeing none, if there are none, I have one. So what is the rationale? What was the rationale for this change?
Sure. So this administrative regulation amendment was filed on April 15th, 2020. So coronavirus was very much a part of our lives. We saw food insecurity issues, and we identified this amendment, administrative regulation, and the policy of which we're discussing, which allows the disqualification of participants of SNAP to potentially endanger those already affected by the coronavirus, already potentially facing food insecurity, and the children who live in their household. So this was decided to be a place where we could make sure assistance in purchasing food was available, especially in light of the coronavirus.
And just to be clear as well, this policy was under consideration and analysis in advance of the coronavirus. However, the coronavirus did spur the need to act more quickly. We have no direct causal relationship between this policy and increased collections. If anything, we have some anecdotal evidence that this policy was adversely affecting the non-custodial parent, children in the non-custodial parent's home, and then, of course, the children upon whom were relying on the non-custodial parent for support. So that is one reason it spurred the emergency regulation and then the corresponding ordinary.
And the SNAP program does already contain incentives for paying child support, so we wanted to remove this disincentive.
So after COVID is gone, hopefully that's as soon as possible, do you envision a move back to the prior reg after?
We do not envision that. We intend to have the ordinary regulation take place so that it's still not an issue. We're not comfortable with possibly having food insecurity in households that may contain children.
Any questions from other members? Seeing none, please call the next regulation. Thank you.
We now move to committee review of effective regulations. The first one is Cabinet for Health and Family Services, Department for Public Health, 902 KAR 2190E.
This administrative regulation establishes face covering requirements.
Thank you. I believe we have Secretary Freelander and Commissioner Stack remotely. Is that true?
That is correct. If you all can hear me, this is Eric Freelander, Secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. I believe
we can hear you. We can hear you. There we go. We can see you now. We can see you now.
Okay, good. All right.
Thank you.
And Stephen Stack, Commissioner for Public Health, is here as well.
Thank you. We can hear you both. And we have a gentleman here with us today.
Yes, Senator. Hi, my name is Wesley Duke. I'm the General Counsel for the Cabinet for Health and Family Services.
Okay, thank you. We're going to, there's been a little press on this regulation. I think that goes without saying. So as a warning to members of the committee and those testifying, we may camp out here for a little while just to get through all the questions. And I realize that we spend a lot of time on other regs, but this is very, very important to the Commonwealth. At this time, I would like to swear in the gentleman getting ready to testify. So if you could hold up your right hand, if you would. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. I'm going to have a number of questions myself, so what I'm going to do is ask a series of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to members of the committee to ask their questions, then I'll come back. So, and this, when I ask these questions, anyone can chime in. So Secretary Freelander or Commissioner Stack, whoever wants to jump in, feel free. So the first question I have is, in the order and in the reg, it talks about scientific studies that were used to promulgate the regulations. And I would like to know what scientific studies were used in formulating the executive order and the emergency regulation.
Certainly. Eric Friedlander, I'm happy to start. First, I want to be clear, there are 3 goals of these regulations. To start, we want to save lives, and we think this if again looking at states, surrounding states, I think we can say that quite clearly. We want to make sure that we are able to open our schools, and we want to make sure that we're able to open our economy. We believe this regulation comports with all 3 of those things and all 3 of those priorities of the governor, and I will say of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. In terms of scientific studies, and I will defer to Dr. Stack, I know that there has been a growing body of evidence relative to scientific studies that masks have an impact. And I believe there are comparisons among states, and I believe that there are continuing studies that are showing the efficacy of these masking rules. Dr. Stack, would you like to chime in?
Thank you, Secretary. So, Mr. Chair, there are studies being published on an ongoing basis. There's more scientific data being compiled on coronavirus, at least this COVID-19 version of it, than probably any other human pathogen in a shorter period of time. It's a constantly evolving field. The Centers for Disease Control and other sources have long lists of research data that support the various recommendations they make. I was notified of this hearing on very short notice, and I don't have a long bibliography to offer you. I will tell you that I spend many hours every day speaking with health officials across the country, both at the local and at the state and at the national level. And it is the shared opinion of every public health professional I have interacted with that the scientific evidence at this time overwhelmingly supports face masks as being an integral step to getting our economy reopened, our businesses reopened, while still controlling the spread of this potentially fatal disease. And so, should you desire, we can produce for you a lengthy bibliography, but I am not able to provide that for you on the spot with the short notice I received for the hearing.
Thank you. I would ask that you would do that if you don't mind. So to summarize, your answer to that question was basically those studies that the CDC has relied on to make the recommendation.
Mr. Chair, those and others. We will get you a list of studies that will support why face masks are considered scientifically to be an integral part of our response to this epidemic.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Second question was, and this is, once again, this is for anyone, was the Kentucky legislature consulted prior to the issuance of the executive order or the emergency regulation?
I could probably speak to that best, Mr. Chairman. During the promulgation of this reg in question, and first of all, can you hear me okay?
You must have a really good face mask.
Okay, I guess I do. So I apologize.
That's okay.
I will speak up. Thank you. No, but during the process of promulgation of this reg, the General Assembly was not counseled.
Thank you.
I would like to add, this is Eric Friedlander, that I have bi-weekly meetings with the chairs of Committee of Jurisdiction, and I know Kelly Rodman, who is nearby. We are often in communication with members of the General Assembly, but the Wes's specific answer stands.
Thank you. Third question was, and this may be a good question for council, I'm not sure, but was a legal analysis done by the cabinet or executive branch prior to issuance of the executive order or the regulation? And I'll just let you answer that one first.
Well, let me ask a clarifying question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
By legal analysis, I can say that I personally, obviously researched KRS 13A, the masking requirements, and so on and so forth to kind of determine the balance between the governor's powers under 39A and the administrative regulation powers under 13A. So I did in fact do an analysis that balanced those two competing statutes and how these regulations, or I'm sorry, how this regulation would fall into that statutory scheme. So that was in fact done by myself.
Okay. And could you provide that to the committee? Is that possible to do that?
In writing?
Yes.
I did not do a legal opinion in writing. I can answer any questions about my, about the
Maybe
things.
internal memorandums or something of that nature. Is that how you did it?
Yes.
Okay. Can you provide that to the committee?
I will provide everything I can go back and find.
Okay. Thank you. I understand that. And according to your analysis, are these actions constitutional?
It is my opinion that they are. KRS 39A provides a number of, I like to use this analogy of a toolbox, a number of tools for the governor to use to deal with an emergency situation, a state of emergency like we have now. One of those is the promulgation of emergency regulation on top of the executive order power. And it's my opinion that the use of 13A falls right in line with those powers. This is not the only time it's been used. The two regulations that are also on the docket today, being Childcare and the SNAP regs, were also done under emergency to address particularly the COVID-19 emergency. And it's my position all those regulations are constitutional.
Thank you. And I probably should have stated this at the beginning. And as a point of reference, the reason this committee will have so many questions on this reg and probably the next reg, the daycare, is that, to your point, these regulations were promulgated under 39A, which basically means that these are laws that have not been passed by the legislature, statutes that have not been passed by the legislature, and everything, all authority to do these regs is under 39A. And so we feel that these require extra scrutiny because, especially in this case, there's been no public comment period either. So I just want to throw that out there. That's the reason why there will be so many questions today on these topics. I'm going to take a breather and let any other members chime in with their questions if they have any. Senator Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too have several questions. As you know, when we found out that we were having a mandatory mask requirement, living in the most populous county, I immediately started getting phone calls. And so I just want to ask one question first. I'll let some other committee members go next. But I had one phone call from a constituent whose husband is hearing impaired and he reads lips. And so they are clearly exempted in this ordinance or in these regs, but yet they have been denied 2 times when they were out this weekend from an establishment, 2 establishments. And the reason is the establishment said, well, we don't know if we'll get in trouble because some patrons over there don't know if you're hearing impaired and we might get called on. And so there's a lot of concern about this exemption for her particular family. And she said, can you please ask what kind of assurances we had that we're not going to be denied access during this next 30-month period because of my husband's hearing impairment.
Well, I can take that as well. I know that one, first of all, in regards to your constituent, I'm happy to talk to the local health department and anyone there to kind of clarify anything in regard to them, because obviously they are exempted, and that's something that we can address. In regard to the regulation as it's written, obviously it's new. There are some questions about the intricacies of it and how it will be applied. We are doing everything we can to do from the cabinet perspective and through the Department of Local Health, the Kentucky Department of Public Health, to work with our local health departments to educate them and to make sure that they can provide any business owner that calls or reaches out to them, to provide them with enough support to make those right decisions. So I will specifically go back and let them know that this is something that's come up, try to put them on notice, and that way they can take some proactive measures to reach out to the local health departments to they can funnel that information out.
And one of the things she suggested is they had been in Florida on vacation, and she said the way that the Florida regs were written, that they didn't have any trouble with his hearing impairment and not wearing a mask. And so I don't know how the Florida regs are written versus how ours are written, but she said she didn't have any trouble down there, but she did in Louisville. And so maybe if we could take a look at that, that might be really helpful for, a number of families.
Yes, I think it's an outstanding idea. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, well, and this is just from some business owners that have contacted me. And I guess one of their biggest questions is if they have an employee who is a good employee, sometimes a long-term employee, but the employee refuses to wear a mask. Can they fire them? Do they let the employee work? What are kind of the legal ramifications if the good employee says, I'm not wearing the mask? How do they handle that?
I think the best advice I could give there, and I may start first and let Dr. Stapp come in more of a medical scientific point of view. But for that particular situation, and this has been my position and my advice to local health departments, DPH, throughout this entire emergency period, is we've always taken the position that the first thing we do with a business owner, with a private citizen, is try to educate and try to support. So therefore, if you have an employee, using your example, that either refuses to wear a mask or for whatever reason doesn't want to, the first thing I would advise any employer to do is to educate them on the benefits of it, the reasoning behind it, and be it the size, be it the practicality, be it their own personal, there's a chance they could be in one of the at-risk categories, and try to do it that way. I'm not here advocating for disciplinary action against employees. We want to try to help people stay healthy and help other people stay healthy. So that's the first advice I would give. Now, as far as application and enforcement, at this time, as this is kind of a developing situation, I would almost have to come back. I'll have to circle back with you on that, on how we're going to do that when the education fails. Obviously, I don't want anyone to lose a job over anything like this. I'd like to try to have a local health department or the employer talk to them and talk them through it.
Yeah, and if you could get back to me on some sort of legal opinion, because I do think that there is some concern that if they fire them, will they, have a lawsuit against them if they can't pay them if they're not working. And so if you could get back to me, that would be really helpful.
I will be happy to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Adams, this is Eric Friedlander again. Just to give an anecdotal piece, I was at my favorite coffee shop, Quill's, by the way, I'll give a plug. They were very thankful to have the backing of the ordinance when they indeed wanted to say to customers that they needed to have a mask on, and they appreciated being able to make state government the heavy in this.
I got a couple follow-up questions based on Senator Adams' question, then we'll go to Senator Thomas. But in your response, you were saying that you would look into this and its developing situation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, these businesses, this is in effect today, so these businesses have to have answers today to what they're doing. So along those lines, I'm going to go down a track now of maybe business questions. How does a business respond to these new regs? So Senator Adams talked about specifically an exemption. So how are business owners supposed to know if a person is subject to an exemption, and is the governor or secretary concerned at all that businesses may be exposed to serious legal liabilities for asking people about those exemptions from the face covering requirement? And specifically, probably a HIPAA concern there. So I'll let you respond to those two, and then we'll go from there with Senator Thomas.
So this is Dr. Stack. Before Wes addresses the legal, I want to reframe this. I think it's important for us all to put this in context. First of all, I can speak only for what I've directly said in this regard, but I have consistently and from the very start acknowledged that this is a disease that is causing horrible disruption to society. It's causing distress to the people who get it, who get severely sick, who end up in hospitals and ICUs, and obviously for those who die and their families who suffer their loss. It's also causing terrible disruption to business at the state level, the national level, and the international level. We have not seen a disease have this kind of impact on society for the entire human population in over a century. It is undeniable that this is a terrible disease that has caused significant hardship for people not only in Kentucky but across the country and across the world. So I'm very sympathetic and empathetic to the people who face these challenges, and I'm grateful to the committee as you identify these, because we are committed to trying to work with folks as best we're able to give guidance that recognizes the realities of a highly contagious disease that causes severe harm to the people most vulnerable to it, and could overrun our hospitals and tax our healthcare capacity beyond its ability to sustain the needs that the community has, while also trying to take steps to get people back to work, back to school, back to play, and back to athletics and all the other things that we need in order to have fulfilling and healthy and balanced lives. This is the reason we're here today, is because this mask order, which was put in place because people were not wearing masks like they needed to, and we are now seeing our case counts increase worrisomely at the base perhaps of the epidemic exponential curve, which means that once you start seeing the increase is multiple weeks of people who are sick in a queue, and the numbers go up very rapidly. So we have to take these sorts of actions to get people back to work and play and school and all those other activities. It is undeniable that there are challenges as we try to navigate the difficulties with this. And I know that I personally, my colleagues at the cabinet and in the government, are committed to working with everybody as best we are able to try to make our response to the virus is reflective of the needs of the general public as we are able to. But at the end of the day, we have to accommodate this virus. The virus will not accommodate us. And so I want you to hear again that we are very sensitive to these other challenges. We want to try to make it as possible for everyone to stay as safe as they are able to. And we will take all of these inputs very much to heart and do our very best to try to address them. So thank you for offering them. But I think if I don't continue to put this in context, we miss the big picture of what we're facing here.
And back to the question in regard to business specific, I know at least this morning I've already had a couple of email interactions through local health departments to businesses that are in their jurisdictions about how to work through these and how to implement these and how to counsel them. So that is ongoing. That will continue to be ongoing. I know there are some conversations with our friends at the Kentucky Labor Cabinet to provide assistance, support, education to businesses. That way they're not hanging out there, because no one wants that. So that process is started, and it will continue to go throughout this entire process. In regard to the exemptions, I think the chair is correct. There's two of them that specifically invoke some of the HIPAA privacy issues. I think the other ones are pretty cut and dry. Children 5 or under, people exercising, so on and so forth. There are two here that specifically have some privacy issues. I think what needs to happen is that we need to, through our health department, through public health, provide more narrow guidance to businesses on how to handle these two specific exemptions. And I will try to work to develop that, to shotgun that out to them, that way they'll have it. But I understand your concerns, I have the same concerns, and we can handle that way. I think that's the best way to do it.
Thank you. Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman West. My first question is to you, Dr. Stack. Dr. Stack, this is Senator Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes, Senator Thomas, I can hear you.
Thank you. Dr. Stack, I think it's important to talk about the reason we have this regulation. We really haven't talked about the purpose and need for this regulation today. It's stated in the introductory paragraph to the Statement of Emergency that this administrative regulation is needed pursuant to KRS 13A 190. It says A1 and A4 to meet an imminent threat to public health, safety, and welfare, and to protect the human health. My first question to you, and I think this needs to be put on the record, is why are mask face coverings necessary here in this state, and we could say for America, at this particular point in time? I need you to answer that question for me first.
Yes, Senator. So thank you for the question. This is a disease that is predominantly spread by our respiratory secretions that comes from our nose and our mouth predominantly. We spray those into the air whenever we talk, sing, laugh, shout, blow wind instruments in a band, anything where we're pushing air out through our nose and our mouth. The disease is very highly contagious. It may affect one person with an infection may infect up to 3 people when you do all the numbers and the big population studies. The disease is lethal for the people most susceptible to it. The death rate is felt to be in the 1% to 2% range, probably, which means, to put that in context, we believe in the next few weeks there'll be 100,000 Americans getting infected daily by this illness, which means we could have 1,000 to 2,000 Americans in a few weeks dying every day from the infection. That is a substantial loss of human life. There is no vaccine to prevent it, there is no cure to cure it, and there is no treatment dedicated to the disease specifically that has been shown to have a dramatic or pronounced impact, and the only treatments we have are for those people who are so sick they have to be admitted to the hospital. So we don't have a pill to give someone like we can some amoxicillin for strep throat if you just go to the doctor's office. So the only steps we have to prevent the spread of this terrible disease and the harm it will cause to human life and wellness is to prevent its transmission. And the simplest and easiest way we can do that is putting a covering over our mouth and our nose so that when we do all those activities of talking, laughing, singing, shouting, we're not spraying the infection into the air. And Senator, I'd add this one last thing, because the science continues to evolve. I think that quite a few of the physicians I've seen and public health experts who've testified have continually voiced our humility about how there is much we still don't know, and we are doing the best we can in a fast-changing situation. But the reality is that this infection may also spread by lingering in the air, and there are infections such as measles that can linger in the air for many, many hours. We don't know all the details about this infection, but if this is the case, then I want to compliment all of you in that room for wearing your masks, because if you're sitting in a room for 2 hours at a time doing a hearing, and there are people in that room who have this infection, the concentration in the air can rise to a sufficient level that you could potentially infect each other. So wearing a mask predominantly keeps you from spreading infection to others, but the evidence continues to evolve, and we're learning more, and it could be that it is in some small way also protecting you somewhat from the infection getting into you. So thank you for that question, Senator.
And thank you for the answer, Dr. Stack. And Mr. Chair, I have a follow-up question with Dr. Stack, if I may, please, sir. Dr. Stack, certainly all of us on this committee have followed this issue closely for the last 4 months, so I don't take that as a given. But I am correct that organizations with expertise such as the World Health Organization, such as the Center for CDC, the Center for Disease, and I can't remember what
Control.
Centers for Disease Control. Both of them have stated that they support mass masks and facial coverings as a way to control and reduce the spread of this virus. Am I correct that those two organizations, have supported and encouraged facial coverings as a means of stopping or controlling this virus?
Yes, sir, that is their current stated public advice.
And Secretary Freelander, one question for you, if I may. Secretary Freelander?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think everyone watching this committee meeting and being aware of this regulation want to know this. This regulation is to go into effect for 30 days, but it says that it could be renewed and extended. My question to you is, on what basis, on what grounds would renewal or continuation of this regulation take place?
Thank you for the question as well. Another piece I want to say, not only is the CDC and the WHO in support of this, we also believe we have the support of the Chamber of Commerce and other businesses across Kentucky. So I do want to make sure that is clear. This will be driven by the virus. This will be driven by compliance. This will be driven by the extent of spread and the positivity rate of tests. As we've seen in states across the country, there has been an unfortunate rise in many states across the country where we are beginning to see their health capacity being outstripped, where they cannot and do not have sufficient ICU beds, hospital beds. We are not there. But the most important thing we can do at this point is make sure that we never get there. We have to prioritize, and we believe we are prioritizing the lives of the citizens of this Commonwealth first. And that's what we're trying to do here. So we will, I don't have a threshold for you, but we will be looking at positivity rates of tests, number of positive tests, our ICU and hospital bed capacities, to make sure that what doesn't happen is that our system gets overrun.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to have a couple questions, and then I'll turn it over to Co-Chair Hale for a question.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Dr. Stack.
Yes.
I will be back in just a minute. This went on obviously substantially longer than 11:30, and I have a conversation I can't exit myself from. So I know the Secretary will take care of this with you and Wes. I'll be back in just a few minutes. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. One of these questions was going to be for Commissioner Stack, so I'll put that to the side for now. Second question here. This is probably for Secretary Freelander, and maybe council can chime in on this. And Senator Thomas brought it up, the idea of the renewal after 30 days. In the regulation, it states it's effective for 30 days and can be renewed. As far as I know, this may be a new process for this committee for administrative regs and how they are implemented. It's my understanding that we can't necessarily do that. Wouldn't there have to be a withdrawal of the regulation and a new regulation put forward? Would that be proper process and procedure to do it that way?
I can speak to that. I think probably a better fit. Yeah, and like you said, I think that probably would be the most effective way to do that after 30 days. As far as the process would go, we would have to actively do that. Now, as far as the factors that would go into why that decision is made, I think Secretary probably speaks to that a little bit better than me.
Certainly, I believe I just spoke to that. So we will be looking at positivity rates. We'll be looking at the rate of positive relative to testing, as well as ICU capacity and hospital bed capacity.
Yeah, my question was more of a legal nature, that we don't think we can, I don't think you can renew a reg. But you've answered the question. Thank you. Co-Chair Hale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Freelander, thank you for being with us today. I have a couple of questions, and I'll just direct it to you, or council may answer this. we realize, we know that the enforcement of this in the businesses is basically the onus is on them to enforce this. Am I correct?
Wes, do you want to?
I can. Senator, I believe that the primary responsibility of this reg is on the individual and the individual business to comply. I think that's correct.
Okay, and then following up on that, my next question is, if they are not abiding by the rules of this and they are allowing people to enter, what would be what would occur at that point? If and it's kind of a two-part question. Let me just go to the second part as well. If the individuals are in that store, small business, Walmart, Lowe's, whatever that may be, if they have entered there and they refuse to wear the mask, or somehow they took the mask off or whatever, what happens at that point? Does this business, how do they enforce? I know that what I've heard is they don't have to serve them, or they can refuse service to them, and I'm correct on that, correct? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then at that point, and I'm not trying to make it complicated, but what would happen at that point then? Would there be law enforcement that would be called to remove that individual, or what would be the next step there?
Well, what I would recommend is, obviously, if it was a situation where there was not, I mean, unfortunately, I think we've all seen on the media some situations that escalated quickly, and no one wants that to ever happen. So let's take that out of the equation. But I think the first thing that would happen would be that a business owner or an employee would approach the person and very respectfully ask them if they would wear a mask, and try to encourage them to do so. And if they didn't, then they could inform them that they can either leave the premises or they will not be serving them there. Then the violation, obviously, in the actual reg, a first offense receives a warning. I think that's there for a reason. That's your opportunity to educate and try to help and try to get through some of this stuff. But the business could, in fact, they could call the local health department, or they could choose to call law enforcement at that time, if the person would not comply at that time.
May I follow up just
Yes, sir.
quickly? In being in some businesses over the weekend, saw actually a majority of people in certain businesses not wearing them. There seemed to be no enforcement from the store managers or store personnel to ask these people to leave. And I was probably one of 2 or 3 people in the store that had my mask on. But also I was very concerned that even some of the employees were not wearing their mask as well. So what is the protocol for that, if that is occurring?
I would have, well, first of all, I think there's two things a person, say a customer like yourself, if they saw that and obviously were concerned by it, the first option would be to call the local health department and have some of their staff go out there and see what's going on. I don't know if it's up yet today. I do know that the Kentucky Safer Hotline, it's my understanding, is going to be staffed back up, for lack of a better term, and they can report that to there, and then and they can take action. And obviously, if they want to call, they can actually call law enforcement too. So there's some options there to do. However, though, say this person is still in and there's a chance the person will not remain there after this happens, but say they're still in the business, first thing would be is to issue a warning, to let them know, you have to wear a mask while you're here. And any 3 of those options are available for a citizen who saw that, or for a business owner who has tried to get someone to wear one and they won't.
I think all of us on this committee we have also, and all of us in this state, we've seen the incredible situations that our businesses have been under through the last few months. It's been devastating for a majority, or for many of them. And again, I applaud the mask. I think it's important for us to wear these masks when we are out in public like that. One other question, if I may ask this.
Yes, sir.
And I have been asked this several times since this executive order was issued, I guess on Friday or Thursday, whichever day it was, about religious services. That has been brought to my attention on several occasions. Are the participants in those religious services required to wear a mask, or do we go back to the original, if the social distancing can be maintained? I guess just my question is, what could I answer those folks? How could I answer them?
I would probably start with referring them back to I know there's specific guidance to religious organizations on the Healthy at Work website. I would first refer them to that as far as social distancing and hygiene and things and activity, of course. But now, however, it would be my position that within all those guidelines that are provided about that the masking requirement would be mandatory unless they fall in one of these exemptions. For example, some of the ones we talked about, hearing impaired, something like that. So these would apply on the masking situation at the religious service.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Got a couple questions, then we'll go to Representative Marzian. There are new fines in this reg. From a statutory perspective, where does the governor or the secretary get the legal authority to impose new fines?
Senator, we actually, I'd like to, if I could circle back with you on this, on the legal analysis that went into that. It may provide a little more definition as to where those came from. I do know we worked with the Labor Cabinet on this. Obviously, KRS 214020, the power of the Cabinet of Health and Family Services in regard to how we respond to infectious disease outbreaks, provide for a fine scheme in there. But I can specifically follow up on this with you on that.
Okay, if it'll help you along those lines, I've got this was Attorney General opinion from '78 by then Attorney General Stevens. After that, Chief Justice Stevens said that he did not believe that the governor had authority to fix the penalty for violation of emergency order. So I'll refer you to that Attorney General opinion.
Give us a on that, thank you.
Quickly, what we see in here that the public hearing was set for September 28th. This being such an important regulation, why would the public hearing for public comment, business comment, be set at such a late date and not done immediately?
Well, Your Honor, I think that was the schedule that we used. Obviously, CHFS, we have a lot of regs, a lot of reg hearings, and we have a year's worth of dates and schedules out. This was the next available time it fell into as far as getting it filed. I believe there's probably an opportunity for a special hearing if need be, but this was just the regularly scheduled reg process that we use. Like I said, I mean, of course, you're all very aware.
Yes.
We have a lot of regulations.
So in other words, that could be moved up if need be.
I think we could accommodate that.
Because I know a lot of businesses.
Excuse me. Hi, this is Donna Little, Deputy Executive Director for the Office of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs with the Cabinet. And the hearing date was set in accordance with KRS 138270. This regulation was filed prior to the July 15th noon hearing date. And so under the House Bill 4 changes from 2019, the hearing is required to be set in the month following the month in which it's published. So it's filed for the July 15th filing date. So it'll be published August 1st, and the hearing's required to be held in September. And like Wes said, we could do a supplemental hearing sooner if Cabinet leadership wants to do that. But to answer Representative Hale's direct question, it was set for September 28th because that's what KRS 138270 requires us.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Marzian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank the cabinet and the governor for issuing this. As we've seen coronavirus explode in Arizona, every intensive care unit bed is full. And I have a 94-year-old mother-in-law and a grandson that has asthma. And I certainly do not want them to be exposed to a virus that could kill them, basically. So I guess I heard on the news, Arizona, every ICU bed is full. I have been a nurse since I was 20, and I worked in ICU, and I've seen patients on ventilators, and you certainly never want to be on a ventilator or any of your loved ones to be on a ventilator. This is a very simple safety measure, and I believe it's extremely selfish that people don't want to wear a mask, even in a religious service. My question to the religious services would be, why would you want to expose the congregation to a deadly virus? And I want business to open, but with the good employee that refuses to wear a mask, to me, is not a very good employee, Senator Adams. What if he doesn't want to clean the toilet or the bathroom? What kind of employee says no to their person that they're working for? I have friends that go shopping, they're elderly, and if the workers are not wearing a mask, they go to the manager and they say, we're taking our business elsewhere. And they do, unless those people mask up. So my question is, why didn't we get this mask mandate earlier? It's simple. It doesn't interfere with my liberty. My liberty is interfered with when someone doesn't wear a mask and exposes me and my 94-year-old mother-in-law. So I guess that's not really a question, it's just a comment. But I want to thank you and the governor for implementing this, just to protect my elderly grandparents, my elderly mother-in-law from perhaps death. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Marzian. And once again, I'd like to reiterate the reason why there are so many questions today is this reg has not gone through the normal statutory process in the legislature and really hasn't had a hearing. So this is the first real chance that the legislature will have to speak on this. So my next question deals with due process. So a person or business that is subject to a fine under this regulation, are they entitled to any kind of hearing or due process if that fine is imposed upon them? And further, as a secondary follow-up question, especially if that business is shut down by the government, are they entitled to any type of due process hearing?
There is no hearing that is provided within the body of the reg. I'm sorry, you go close to the mic.
Yeah.
I apologize about that.
You're good.
No, there is no hearing that is provided here in the reg. However, if a business is to the extreme, if they are in fact forced to close, that's probably worst case scenario here, which no one wants to see. I know nothing that would prevent them from seeking due process in the courts. But as far as the body of the reg, we did not establish a hearing process.
Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Chairman West. Thank you for being with us today. This is a very important topic, and we all appreciate the opportunity to ask these questions because it's important not only to our role on this committee, because I would like to make it clear that our role is not to determine safety or efficacy of a mask. Our role is looking at how the regulation is filed and how that applies to our state constitution. So my question is in that vein because I too, Senator Marzian, I have an 83-year-old mother. I have family and friends that have lung transplants, have compromised immune systems. So this is not something that we're looking at in that respect. But often, it's been said that I'm wearing my mask to protect others. So to make a case of negligence, would you also have to establish a legal obligation to protect the other person?
In a civil litigation situation
Well,
let me make sure I understand. I'm sorry. Let me make sure.
Okay.
No.
Well, what's happening right now, and this goes back to the enforcement question too, is that it's falling on the backs of the business owners, or it's also turning into a case of social humiliation. You know, people are posting and shaming and that type of thing.
It would be I guess my position in regard to this is if a business owner had employees that they were not ensuring complied with the regulation, that there in fact could be, could be, I mean, everything has to be proven, as we know that, but there could be a claim that the person is being negligent if a person comes into the store and the employees are not wearing a mask. However, I also think if a business owner and his staff are complying with all the requirements, and they have patrons that are not wearing masks, and they take all necessary action to either get that person a mask, ask them to leave, receive or refuse them service, then they have taken all necessary steps that would prevent them or where a person could not accuse them of being negligent, because they've done everything that they were supposed to do, and of course the next step would be to call law enforcement, health department, so on and so forth. But now, if a business owner is openly not violating the reg by their employees, and someone let's worst case scenario, get sick, I think there probably could be at least an argument that business owner was being negligent by not making his people, or his or her people, wear their mask. And yes, and just to follow up something Secretary Friedlander said a while ago, it's questions like this, which are good questions, which make it more important for me to emphasize that the Chamber of Commerce is on board with this. I mean, they are the voice of the business owner, and they are supportive of this with all these issues that are out there in play. So I think it's just very important to put that out there into the equation.
Well, it is, and I think that's, again, it's a novel virus. We're all in a situation where we've never been, and so we're trying to navigate, learn, adapt, and I think that is creating a sense of social mistrust because things are changing so rapidly. And so if you're trying to get buy-in, I just think it would behoove the governor's office and everyone to work with us as much as possible, because we are the people that are closest to our communities. And so I think our local business owners, our local officials would like to be involved in this process. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to make the most.
Representative Prejudice, Eric Friedlander, I have been deferring all legal questions to Wes because I'm not an attorney. But the other thing I want to say to you, and actually just to echo, I think, some of what's already been said, is this, and I won't pretend to be as articulate as Dr. Stack, but this is the way that we can best protect folks right now without a vaccine, without a really good course of treatment. The way that we stop the spread of this disease is with this. It's making sure, we wash our hands. It's making sure that we have social distance. These are the things that we know will work. And I'm very concerned with what's happening in other states. I'm very concerned with that. And I think it's incumbent on us as we learn, right? Because this is all a learning process. You said it very well. We haven't seen anything like this since 1918. Let me tell you, it's not the most exciting time to be the Secretary of the Health and Family Services. But we have to learn, and some of this is learning together. And so I appreciate your comment, and know that we are trying to do the best we can in a situation that none of us have faced before.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions, and then we'll go to Senator Adams has a question. These two questions are for Commissioner Stack if he's there. If he's not there, then Secretary Friedlander, it's up to you. So is Commissioner Stack back yet? He is not. That's fine. No problem. Secretary Friedlander, if you would try to answer these questions.
I'll do my best.
Earlier in the committee, we heard about that the reason for these regs, these face mask regs, was because of recommendations from CDC and the World Health Organization. So as late as March 31st of this year, those two organizations, CDC, World Health Organization, and the U.S. Surgeon General, told our citizens to not wear masks, or that was their recommendation at that time. Why the change? Why was it? Why were they saying that in March 31st, but saying something different today?
I'm so hopeful that Dr. Stack is on the line, but I will do my best. I think fair assessment, the requirements around masks have changed as we have learned more. Dr. Stack talked earlier about going to supply you with bibliography of studies that have now confirmed that when we wear masks, it keeps us from spewing particulates in the air, singing, yelling, playing an instrument, those kinds of things. We know that the masks prevent that from us to someone else. And so that has become, as it has been studied across the country and across the world, to be, I believe, proven that this makes a difference. And I think, like so many things with this, again, novel coronavirus, we are learning through this process, and we are making the best recommendations we can based on the science that's available to us now, that this is the way that we prevent additional spread. So this has been, as we've learned about this virus, as we've understood, it's not necessarily a straight respiratory virus, but also really seems to be attacking blood vessels. Our knowledge of this virus is evolving. It didn't exist, or we didn't know it existed, I think, back in October. So this is rapid. Our learning is also rapid. So we are coming forward now with what appears to be, and my understanding is, settled science around the wearing of masks.
Thank you for that. Dr. Stack touched on this, and within the reg itself, one of the reasons for the issuance of the new reg was that the number of cases has increased dramatically. So we know the cases have gone up recently, but the death rate seems to be decreasing. Is part of the reason for the increase in cases the fact that we're testing more and that more people are having contact with hospitals now that other services are allowed now at in the hospital setting? So in other words, anyone who has contact with the hospital is now tested. So are those two items, would those be reasons for a spike in cases?
Well, as I'm not an attorney, I'm also not a scientist, but here we go. Here's my understanding. My understanding is this. Deaths is a lagging indicator. My fear is that as we've seen increased cases across the country, deaths are going to follow. It's just not a leading indicator, meaning that a month down the line, we're going to see our death rates increase because of the increase in positive tests. I'll also say this. Not only have we increased tests, but the rate of positivity, and that's what I meant earlier when I said the rate of positivity, the rate of positive tests is going up. So it's not that there are more tests as much as those we are testing, the rate that they come back with is higher. 2 weeks ago, I think we were around a 2% positivity rate in terms of our testing. Last week it was, got around 3. This last week we're up to 4, a little over 4. So we are seeing an increase in the rate of positivity of our tests. So I don't think it relates just to that. I think I saw Florida was up to 17%. I might not have that number right.
But Florida, the rate of positivity is increasing. That's what's alarming. What's alarming is that with tests, we are seeing the rate of those tests, the rate of individuals in our community coming back higher as testing positive for COVID. That's what our wellness, that is what is most alarming to me. And then following that, as we see in hospitalizations, but death is a lagging indicator.
Thank you. Senator Adams.
Thanks, and I don't really have a question, but I wanted to follow up on something that Secretary Freelander you just said, and that is, you're right, we have not seen this before. And these questions are in no way, in my opinion, of discussing the science of it, because I think it's absolutely wholly appropriate that we all wear masks to protect ourselves and our loved ones and those that we don't even know. But you did mention the fact of communication, and this is such a new situation that, asking questions I don't think is in any way denigrating the executive order, because I agree with the executive order wholeheartedly. But this is new territory, and these are new questions, and there are businesses that have concerns, and there are employees that have concerns. And so I really want to continue working together on how this unfolds, because I think it's all new, and as it unfolds, if we keep up that communication, I think we can get these questions answered for many of our constituents, many of our businesses, and we can have a really positive experience with this. But that communication is key, and so I appreciate those sentiments that you laid out, because I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, and hopefully we can, keep everything civil and answer questions and talk about new situations that arise, because it will happen.
Senator Adams, thank you. I meant to do this right off the bat. Chairman West and Chairman Hale, the opportunity to come and talk to you all today, I appreciate. I think you're right. We cannot have too much communication. It is not possible, and we will do our best to continue to do that. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with you all. And Senator Adams, you're exactly right. There's so much we still don't know. So we'll have to continue to do our best to let. I appreciate what you all are saying in terms of what you're seeing on the ground. We're seeing it too, and that's the kind of thing that I think this kind of dialogue is still important. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me say there's been some implicit statements that the governor has not been open or willing to discuss his actions. I would say just the contrary. I think when you look at what Governor Beshear has done over the last 4 months, he's been quite transparent in his discussions and providing information about this coronavirus, and been very open in talking with people from all sectors of our state, business, education, you name it. So I would applaud the governor as he's been applauded across this nation. When you look at Kentucky, compared with our neighboring states and our results, we've been the envy. We've been the leader. I see Secretary Freelander shaking his head in terms of how we've truly addressed this coronavirus in a way that saved Kentucky lives. And on that point, it was said very early in our discussions that we would hate to see someone get arrested for not complying with this regulation, this order. Well, I have to say what I would really hate to see is another 1,000 or 2,000 deaths of Kentuckians because of the fact that they're healthy now, and because someone didn't wear a mask, they caught this airborne virus and died. I'm all for saving lives. I think that's far more important than saving jobs. To your point, Secretary Freelander, the latest results in Florida is that Florida has a 20% positive rate, 20%. And what you're telling me here in Kentucky is that as of today, we've seen a doubling of our positive rate in the last week, which is quite alarming.
Yes, sir. And you mentioned the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. If you go on their website and you pull up like the states across the country, Kentucky is in we are in a good place, but I don't necessarily mean that geographically, because if you look at the states around us, we are in, I think, a much better position. That's why taking early action like this is so very, very important.
Are you done, Senator Thomas? We'll take
Yes,
this.
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from other members of the committee this time? I think this has been a really good discussion. Couple ending points. I would say that there's my number one recommendation as chairman of this committee is that there be an immediate public hearing on this regulation. We've discussed that. We know the cabinet has the ability to do that. And rather than waiting till September 28th, there appear, although well-intentioned, let me be clear. I feel that this is well-intentioned. I feel that Commissioner Stack and Secretary Freelander are doing their best to prevent the spread and do that. But unfortunately, this committee it's the boring committee. We talk about process and legalities and the rule of law. And in my opinion, there are significant problems with due process, legal authority for fines, legal authority for renewal of the regulation. But having said that, those are my recommendations. I'm the chairman, but I'm just one member of this committee. Do we have any other questions from any other members of the committee? Do we have any other actions or motions on this regulation to be made by any other members of the committee? Seeing none, please call the next regulation. Thank you, everyone, for being here and testifying. We appreciate both of you and Dr. Stack as well for being with us and going through this process. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry I had to step away.
I think I'm remaining for the next one too, so.
Department for Community-Based Services.
Could you hold on just a second?
Sure.
Dr. Stack, did you time that just so you came back at the perfect time?
No, thank you. It would be good timing. No, but I've been back for about 10 minutes, but the secretary handled the questions so well, it's better for me to remain silent.
You came back at the perfect time. Thank you so much. Please call the next regulation.
Department for Community-Based Services, Division of Childcare, 922 KAR 2400 emergency.
This administrative regulation establishes health and safety standards for certified family child care homes and licensed child care centers due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the declared state of emergency, including requirements on the following: reopening protocol, social distancing, business practices, cleaning and sanitizing, screening and illness, personal protective equipment, training, and safety and background checks.
Thank you so much. We have no amendments, committee amendments, or agency amendments. So if the presenters testifying in favor would state their names for the record and then proceed.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Began. I'm the Regulation Coordinator for the Department for Community-Based Services.
I'm Dr. Sarah Vanover. I'm the Director for the Division of Childcare.
And yes, for sure, Wesley Duke, General Counsel, CHFS.
You're earning your pay today.
Yes, sir, on a Monday.
Please proceed.
There were just a few points that we wanted to make sure that we shared with you regarding the regulation. When we looked at compiling the regulation and figuring out what would be in the best interest of our child care programs as they began to reopen throughout the state, we did collect data from several different sources. One of which was a community group that was sponsored. It started in Lexington, Kentucky, but had professionals throughout the state that were child care providers, advocates, and it was sponsored through the Child Care Council of Kentucky, which you will hear from in just a little while. We got input from all of those in the field through that, and a extensive 20-plus page recommendation that they put forth. We also met with our limited duration child care centers, which were the emergency centers formed during the course of the pandemic closures. And I went out to several of those face-to-face and saw how they were operating and talked to them about the minimum requirements that they were implementing, as well as what increased protocol they had added to the minimum requirements during the limited duration centers and during the closure. We also reached out to advocacy groups, as well as a plethora of other states that I communicated with to see where their starting point was in their state. For states that did not close, how they kept the centers, the small amount of centers in every state that remained open, and what types of impact it had if they left their centers open, how they were restarting, what numbers they started with in group sizes, and their successes and some of their failures, in order to collect data that would give us an idea in Kentucky where to restart. Based on that, we also looked at the guidance from medical professionals. Many of us that helped contribute to some of these regulations, like the community group, myself, have a great background in early childhood education, but not necessarily in the medical field. And so we also reached out to make sure that the CDC, our own local health departments, as well as epidemiologists watching the pandemic, gave us insight on the best ways to control the spread once we combined these groups of young children. And we had a group that was formed through state agencies and partners that was combined with the Division of Regulated Child Care of the Division of Child Care, the Governor's Office of Early Childhood, Child Care Aware Services through the University of Kentucky, which is a contract agency with the cabinet, and the Department of Public Health. The regulations were formed as a starting point. They are not permanent, but it gave us an idea to watch as we started with the reopening of child care and to see the impact so that we would be able to monitor cases for both adults and children in centers, and then change recommendations as we move through the pandemic based on what would be in the best interest for the health and safety of the young children and of the staff that were within the programs.
I'll go into a little bit of the process. The emergency regulation was filed on June 15th. It did not have an accompanying ordinary reg, as it's deemed to be temporary in nature, so it will eventually expire if not withdrawn before that point. Upon filing pursuant to KRS 13A, it immediately entered the public comment period, which again pursuant to 13A is at least a 2.5-month long process. So the public hearing is set for August 24th. It could not be any earlier than August 21st pursuant to KRS 13A. And then once the comment period closes, our agency is required under KRS 13A to consider all comments received, all testimony given at the public hearing, and draft a statement of consideration where we respond to each of those comments. Also, the emergency administrative regulation, this is spelled out in 13A, but we also confirmed with staff an emergency administrative regulation is not allowed to be amended. So the only alternative to having it expire after the 290 days is to withdraw the e-reg and possibly replace it with another one. So I just wanted you to know that we did look into all the requirements around amending an administrative regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the committee on this regulation? Representative Frazier.
Thank you for being with us today. My question is in regards to the regulations for the childcare centers as opposed to the regulations for the limited duration centers, because I understand it's quite vastly different. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Okay. The limited duration centers did not have regulations. They were used by policy and they were monitored by the Division of Regulated Childcare, who their typical role is to enforce the regulations that the Division of Childcare writes. The LDC requirements were written very minimally because at the time, at the onset of the pandemic, we needed to make sure that there was availability for all hospital childcare that was needed and that our first responders had the care. And those were set up in a way that if we needed to have pop-up childcare on site at hospitals, that it would be available. The other thing was with the LDC requirements, again, many of the hospitals themselves enhanced their own regulations. So although the LDC requirements that were printed were very low, many of the hospitals were implementing required practices for their staff to change out of their scrubs and into clean clothes before picking up their children, and many enhanced protocols that kept children safe during this time period. We also know that during this time period, almost nothing else was open except for agency-sponsored and working through emergency employees. So there was a general decrease in the illness spread compared to now. When the new child care regulations were crafted and implemented, it was at the same time that restaurants were reopening, movie theaters, trampoline parks, lots of areas where young children go. And so as we've had these children now coming into childcare, we basically saw cases start to increase as soon as the rest of the world opened up. Where the LDCs didn't have that implemented is because those families got up, took the child to childcare, went to the hospital or the grocery store, picked their child up, went home, and they were not interacting with the vast majority of the community. Now, many of these children are going out to athletic practices and lots of different things. And so within the centers, our goal is to make sure that health and safety is controlled in a manner so that when these groups are together, we spread the virus as minimally as possibly. We know there will be cases and there have been cases that are occurring, but the things like the PPE requirements, the small group sizes that stay together throughout the day and do not mix large groups and things like that were put into place so that the spread of the virus would be reduced as much as possible.
And I know there are some remarks too about temporary walls and things like that that have to be put up. Was the fire marshal consulted? Like, is that something that's going to pass inspections? Because, you know, we still have building codes that we have to adhere to and that type of thing too.
The fire marshal has a spot on our Child Care Advisory Council that meets every 3 months. When we did write these regs, I did reach out to our consultant at the fire marshal's office to talk about things like what if centers took the children's shoes off at the door so that they weren't carrying in those outside germs and things. And the response that I got as we asked a lot of these questions was that the risk seems more limited. The risk of using the new regs is less than the risk of not putting them into place. Temporary walls are not required. That is not something that is required. However, if a center chooses to use temporary walls so that they can maximize the capacity within their center, then we did have 6 different stipulations that were placed on those so that we could make sure that they were stable enough that a child could not pull something down on top of them, so that it wasn't something like a shower curtain pulled in the middle of 2 rooms where germs could still easily spread. But no center was required to have that implemented in place. And when centers did decide to use those so that they could maximize their capacity to increase their revenue during this time period, they did have to send documentation of what they were doing in their center to the Division of Child Care to be reviewed to make sure that it met the qualifications that we asked for.
Thank you very much.
Got a question now for Mr. Duke, counsel. Could you briefly comment on the court case that's involved in this and just give us a status report on kind of where it stands?
I can do that. Currently, the child care ratio sections of the reg are currently under a temporary restraining order from the Boone Circuit Court. The rest of the reg is in place. The temporary restraining order was very narrowly drawn to focus on that. I can also let the court know we were set for let the chairman know that we are set for hearing at 10 o'clock on Thursday, July 16th, for a full evidentiary hearing in Boone. We petitioned the Court of Appeals for a writ of prohibition, as the chairman may not be aware because he's been in the hearings. That was denied on procedural grounds this morning. So it's my synopsis that we will be proceeding to full hearing on Thursday to create a record.
Any question, Co-Chair Hale?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In a prior committee meeting that I sat in on here approximately a month ago, we had come and testify before our committee that day some child care providers. And each one of them, all of them said that they definitely would not be able to operate for a extensive period of time under the regulations that had been set as far as the amount of individuals that could be within these centers. I know that there has been, over the course of the last few years, and I'm not sure what this number is, but I know there has been a huge decline in the number of centers, child care centers that's in the state of Kentucky. I know it, and honestly, I don't know what that number is, but I know it is reduced considerably. I guess the concern and the question I have is if we continue like we are going right now, we're probably going to be seeing several others very possibly close. And as those close, this takes away many options for people. There's a lot of individuals that, especially during the time that we're in right now, don't have neighbors or grandparents or someone else that can watch their children if they can even get back to work. And that's one of the problems I think that we're facing is if we can getting these people back to work, who's going to provide them child care? And so I guess my question is, looking at have you really looked at the economic impact of that, of these centers, possibly several more of them closing because they cannot operate under these rules that are set in place right now? What is your recommendation as we go forward? And I know the gentleman just mentioned the court case right there, but as we even go forward, even beyond that court case, what is your recommendation for many of these places that are going to be closing? How are we going to supply facilities to accommodate these children?
Can you speak to funding as well?
Yes, I understand that there is a huge financial impact for our providers, and I have been a child care provider. I've worked in this field 22 years. These are my colleagues, and I know that this is a business that does not work for profit. It's a business that really works to serve the families.
Absolutely.
We do not want to lose a large amount of capacity in the state of Kentucky. We have lost some significantly already. It was predominantly in in-home centers, which are much smaller than center-based care, but many of those programs we still need back. Now, several of the things that we've taken into consideration during this time period is ways that we can supplement for the centers as they've been closed or as they're reopening. The CARES Act did give us $67 million for the state of Kentucky, and we did everything that we could to turn that money around quickly and get it out to all centers to make sure that there was money going out. And we used that for sustainment stipends so they could pay fixed expenses, even if they had staff that were on unemployment at that time. Mortgage and bills were still coming in. We gave bonuses to the staff that were willing to step up and work in emergency centers during the closure and work with a high-risk population of families since their parents were essential employees. And we also are currently sending out funds to help with PPE and cleaning support. These funds were amazing that we got from the federal government. However, I can tell you that they're not enough to continue the sustaining that we need. More funding would be an immense help. And our programs cannot stay in this type of situation for an extended period of time, and that was never the intent. The intent was for us to continuously review the data, review the number of cases, and make adaptations as we were able to increase those group sizes and to benefit our centers as much as possible to eventually get back to a full capacity range. All the states are doing varying things right now, and I've reached out to state administrators in every state. I can tell you, though, when I look at states that have moved back to full capacity, those states include Texas and Florida and North Carolina, and states where the number of COVID cases are climbing extremely high right now. Other states that have been more reserved, like Kentucky, have had more success in keeping those numbers lower. Most states started off at the 10 group size, but they have not necessarily stayed there. We reopened later than some states did, and so we started off at that point to get an idea of what the spread of the illness would look like, and then as we continue to get data, we'll be able to review that data and see where it is beneficial for us to go. Right now, the family child care homes have been open just over a month, and our center-based care has been open. It'll be a month on Wednesday. So we are looking to see what is happening within the centers. We have had cases both of children and adults. And like I said, with all the other businesses reopening, that does affect our children and child care. It's hard to see where those cases were contacted, but we are trying to do whatever we can within the centers based on the illness screening, based on wearing of PPE, based on all the cleaning and sanitizing procedures that we've asked our centers to really up their game on those things to make sure that the virus is spread as little as possible.
May I follow up just real quickly, Senator?
Yes, sir.
And I thank you for that. And those people that testified before our committee that day actually had received money. And even though they were grateful for that wasn't enough to be able to keep those open. And that's been over a month ago, and I'm not sure if they've actually closed or not. But one of the concerns that was brought before us was if you had children in there of the same family, and they were in different areas of that facility during the day, but even after basically most people had gone, they still had to have adults with each one of those in separate rooms, even though they were going to leave that facility and go get in the same car and go home. That was another concern. They were having to provide another employee there, and it just seemed like those steps that were put into place right there was really making it almost impossible for these places to remain open. And again, I think it's just going to be a huge economic detriment to our state as more and more of these places close.
It has definitely been challenging. I will say that the group cohorts of children that stay together throughout the day, those were recommendations not only from the CDC, but also from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And when those children stay together all day, much like a family, the spread of the illness is significantly reduced in that manner. And there are reasons that family members, even in different age ranges, stay apart during the day. For instance, keeping an infant with older children can often be a risk because if there are older children in the room who have not been around an infant, if we have those different groups, we don't want younger children to get injured from being in a mixed group with older children. And so there are different concerns listed there. But again, yes, long-term, this is a significant financial impact, and we want to make sure that we're reviewing data frequently and making the best choices for our providers.
It's certainly a challenge for those folks. It really is. But thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. This time we have a couple of people scheduled to speak against the regulation. If you guys don't mind, if you step back and let them come forward. On my sheet here, I show the Childcare Council of Kentucky Incorporated. Once you're ready, if you would state your name for the record, and then you are free to proceed whenever you're ready.
Jennifer Washburn. I'm the Executive Director of iKids Childhood Enrichment Center in Benton, Kentucky.
Brad Stevenson, Executive Director of the Childcare Council of Kentucky. Let me start. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, Chairman and Subcommittee. We spoke 2 weeks ago about this very thing to another committee. And I want to start with, I appreciate what the Cabinet has done to support child care providers through this. They have done a fantastic job of being responsive and open, providing CARES Act funding to ensure centers could stay in business and then reopen, at least the majority of them. And those dollars have allowed for that to happen. But now that centers are reopened and there's no additional funding that's coming through CARES Act, at least that we know of right this moment, centers are beginning to realize the real financial crisis that these regulations put them in. As Dr. Vanover noted, we had a committee of about 80 folks throughout the state of Kentucky who submitted a list of recommendations to the governor's office and his staff back before reopening took place. And one of the things that we did not recommend in that was any restrictions on group sizes. The CDC, from what we can tell, did not restrict group sizes in any of their recommendations. And so our recommendations did not include any restrictions on group sizes as well. We thought the regulation requirements around group sizes and staff-to-child ratio keep children safe and healthy in their facilities, and we thought that would be a great guide for the reopening process. That group consisted of, again, about 80 folks, about 20 limited duration childcare facilities who had been operating from basically March the 20th through some are still operating, but it included many of those individuals who spoke into what those requirements should be. As we progressed and things started to
Can I stop you there for
Yes,
just a
sir.
second? You provided us with this document, is that true?
I'm going to get to that. I got two things I provided you with: a survey that we've done recently to childcare providers, and then the limited duration guidelines that were put forth when centers opened on March the 20th.
So all members should have this information in front of you. It was handed out earlier.
So I want to speak to the survey, and I want to be brief about this because I know you've had a long meeting already. We surveyed nearly 2,100. I think the number is somewhere between 2,000 and 2,100 total child care providers licensed and certified that operate in Kentucky today, at least pre-COVID. They were about that number. We sent out a survey a couple of weeks ago, about 10 days ago actually, after they'd been in operation and had the ability to reopen their facilities to get feedback on what it was like, where they were financially, how many had reopened, et cetera. We got just under 600 responses in the 10 days from putting that out, and we're getting more responses every day. But as of yesterday, when I ran the analysis on this, we had 592 responses from 102 counties throughout Kentucky. We had 499 Type 1 facilities respond, 23 Type 2, and 70 childcare homes, family childcare homes, which is a great response from the childcare home provider. There's only about 230 of those throughout the entire state of Kentucky. So to think we got that many responses from the family childcare home group is amazing. From those that responded, there was a total capacity of just under 52,000. That is licensed capacity. Doesn't mean there are that many kids enrolled, but it means what they're licensed to care for. Pre-COVID, we asked what your enrollment was. 41,631 pre-COVID shut down. And as of the time that these folks responded to the survey, there was just over 24,000 enrolled. So you can see that enrollment is down as well already, and that leads to this financial crisis that we think many facilities are going to be in. 84% of those that responded said they accept the Child Care Assistance Program, which is the state subsidy program that reimburses children who qualify. And in that number of the 84%, there were 7,093 children that was responded that are in care right now receiving child care assistance for centers who have reopened, okay? 469 reported that they had reopened. 69 have not reopened but have a date set. 17 have not reopened and do not know when they're going to reopen. And then 37 did not respond to the reopening status. The average reopen date is August 10th through the 14th, which makes sense. That's when a lot of schools either are preparing to start back or will be starting back. So it makes sense that some of those centers would be delaying until then. We ask, will your center have to close if group restrictions are not removed? 43% of respondents said yes, that they would have to make a choice to close if restrictions were not removed. 57% said no. Here's a critical number in this. Of the 43%, 214 providers who accept CCAP reported that they would close, which accounts for 4,421 children who are most vulnerable children receiving state subsidy that are enrolled in the 214 providers who said that they would close. That's part of the 43% of providers. This is in alignment with a national study that the National Association for the Education of Young Children did about a month, 5 to 6 weeks ago, that said that nationally, nearly 40% of providers reported that they may have to close their businesses due to the COVID disease and all of the things that come after that with reopening, the financial piece of it. It's in alignment with that. I do know the Pritchard Committee did a survey pre-reopening, and up to 15% of providers noted at that point that they may have to close their businesses permanently. That was before having any idea what the reality of reopening was actually going to look like. The majority of the respondents said that they would have to close somewhere around November the 1st is the projected date of reclosing. Obviously, there's a range in there, but when I looked at all of the ranges and analyzed the data, November the 1st was the date. Jennifer is going to say something similar in her own personal business, very close to that date. Weekly income loss. 299 folks responded of numbers that I could use. A lot of people said a lot. I don't know what a lot is. It's relative to their business. So I didn't use any responses that weren't actual numbers. $3,600 is the average loss per center of the 299 that responded. That's $1,076,400 a week. That is projected loss from these facilities, the 299 that have responded. Obviously, that's a range, anywhere from $100,000 to $35,000 a week with some of the respondents based on their capacity and the number of facilities that they actually operate within their local communities. We asked the question, tours are not allowed right now due to the restrictions, and a lot of facilities do in-person tours as a recruitment tool for new families, especially with schools starting back up. That is a tool that they use to build their capacity and their enrollment. 57% reported that they would need the ability to do in-person tours. Those would be individual families coming into the facility following all the guidelines. The average number of years of providing service was 18 years of service. We had one facility that reported they'd been in business 90 years. 90 years, and there's a potential that they may have to close their business if things do not change drastically for them. I'll tell you that business probably won't close because they have support of other financial means within where they sit. But that is a rare place to be today for the nearly 2,000 childcare facilities who have no other means of income other than enrollment fees, state subsidies that they receive from our state. And so we are at a really dire straits with many facilities. Somebody, I think Representative Hale asked the question about the decrease in childcare. If you look back in 2012, there were nearly 4,000 childcare providers. By 2017, that number was down to 2,400, and today it's just right at 2,000. So that number has increasingly gone down over the years. Part of the reason from 2012 to 17 was the Child Care Assistance Program was on a freeze for some of that time period, and due to that, several facilities had to close their doors because of the subsidy being frozen at that time. So I do think, again, I want to commend the cabinet for the work that they've done to get centers in the process of reopening, but if we have to do something different as it relates to group sizes in order to allow these facilities to do what they do every day. These facilities have done this for years, and they are following regulations, health and safety practices to keep kids safe and healthy. And so something has to be done on the group sizes, or lots of facilities are going to be closing their doors.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. First of all, yes, I want to mirror Mr. Stevenson in saying absolutely thank you to the cabinet for their hard work up to this point. They have worked very hard to make sure that we have been financially supported to be able to start up again, and then to support those spaces while they were closed. What the concern is, however, is the ability to continue and to maintain these operations under these current restrictions. You have in front of you a paper that I had passed out that talks on one side some things that I've said the multiple times that I've been here already, and on the second side it talks about the real numbers. These are my real numbers for my NACI accredited 5-star facility for the time from June 15th to July 12th. Looks like this. Okay.
Everyone should have that on the committee.
Correct. So on June 15th, childcare centers were able to reopen, and that's when we changed from being and operating as an LDC back to our regular license. In that time, from June 15th to July 12th, our real number payroll is up 15.3%, and our income is down 20.8%. The net income, which is a loss for June 15th to July 12th, is a negative $15,692.47. So to say that we are trying to operate to make a profit is actually very much incorrect. We're trying to be able to stay alive, to stay relevant, and to be able to continue to serve our community. If the emergency regulations remain unchanged, we will close October 12th. 2020, which does go very much in line with what Mr. Stevenson said earlier in his survey. And this will be because we have exhausted all the stipends, all the CARES monies, all of our savings to date, and tuition alone will absolutely not cover monthly operating costs. On that date, October 12th, 2020, we will be at zero. We will have to close. Again, I have to have you hear me say to you, it's not about profits. It's about survival. I also have 2 school-age programs that operate inside 2 local elementary schools. Each of those are licensed for about 40 children. The emergency regulations limit me to 10 children within that school setting. Even though we're in the cafeteria, we're licensed for 40. The emergency regulations limit me to 10. This would mean that we remove the children who've been together all day from their school cohort and mix them into the community. I would also have to inform 60 children that they no longer have after-school care. We as childcare providers are asking for consistency. Dr. Vanover talked earlier about the fact that children, when they leave our spaces of 10, go out into the community, they go to swimming pools, they go to amusement parks, they go to trampoline venues, all of which have larger sizes than we do. We mask, we constantly sanitize, we limit contacts, but we have zero control when they leave us. And yet we're the ones who are closed for the 14 days, and these other spaces don't face consequences by these children being able to come into their spaces with these larger sizes for long periods of time. Additionally, the maximum number of pupils in a class K through 3rd grade is 24. And again, I'm restricted to 10 with that school-age care. If you have questions about what actual group size is, on the other side, it shows you what the state ratios are. You also see what my ratios are, as I am a NACI, NAEYC accredited center, also a 5-star center as recognized by the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Education in the state of Kentucky. That's the highest rating that you can have. I do ask for our sake, for the ability to continue with quality care for our children and our families in our community, that you strongly consider the impacts of maintaining the group size restrictions. We agree with masking in our children and our teachers. We agree with sanitizing constantly. Sanitizing is something we've always done. We agree with limiting contacts from the adults coming into our space. What we need is assistance in being able to go from 10 3-year-olds to 12 for those centers that don't go by Macy's standards, for them to be able to continue their operations so that they can continue beyond COVID. Right now, these regulations are set to be expiring March 5th, 2021. That's way too long from now. March 5th, 2021 is when these e-regs expire. I know we have a comment period, August 24th, but we need to know when things may get back to us being able to function, because as I said to you, we will close October 12th, 2020, and that goes a 5-star NACE accredited center in far western Kentucky, and all of those families will have to make other choices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our first question will be from Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, Mr. Washburn, Ms. Washburn, Stevenson, good to see you again.
Thank you.
Let me say at the outset, Mr. Chair, that I was in attendance with that meeting with Representative Hale a month ago when Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Washburn spoke. And at that meeting, I mentioned the impact that this virus has had on younger people. And I was tasked by our colleague, Senator Carroll, to come back with some information. Well, I'm going to do that at that next meeting, Representative Hale. But I want you and the committee members and the public to Washington, that is watching today, see what this math is tough to see.
I understand.
To know this. I've done some fact finding. And Mr. Stevenson, Ms. Washburn, as of July 3rd of this year, there were close to 957 minors. Let me repeat that. 957 minors that had contracted the coronavirus. About half of that, and again, I'll provide this at a subsequent meeting, about half of that were children 10 and under. Now, that number is probably now, with the spike we've seen in Kentucky, close to 1,000, but I will document that. Given the fact that we've had close to 1,000 minors contract the coronavirus, and we've had at least one death that we know of, isn't our Cabinet for Health and Family Services and our governor acting responsibly to try to ensure that there's not the next child that gets this disease, gets this virus, and there's not the next death that occurs to a minor? My question is, hasn't the restrictions and the regulations that have been promulgated today by this cabinet, by the governor, aren't those really reasonable in light of what we've seen here in Kentucky now, and with the spike that's occurring in Kentucky with this virus?
Let me add this. We did not say this. 100 limited duration childcare facilities operated from March the 20th through June the 15th. There are still facilities operating today under those guidelines. There was not a single case with the minimal requirements that you have as a committee. It's a page and a quarter. There was not a single case reported to the Division of Regulated Child Care through May the 25th, with limited regulations on them. No mention of group sizes, no reference to group sizes. And in fact, those regulations required less square feet per child than what the pre-COVID regulations required under regulated child care at the time. 30 square feet per child for limited duration care and 35 square feet under regulations pre-COVID. Those are numbers directly from the Division of Regulated Child Care, minimal requirements. And I'm not saying, Senator Thomas, that there certainly have been some cases. I know for a fact in Lexington, the Friday before centers reopened, there was a case or two in a child care facility there. So the risk is certainly there. I'm saying with minimal requirements for 12 weeks, with some of the most vulnerable folks coming in and out of those facilities, working in hospitals. And I know Dr. Vanover noted that some hospitals required changing of clothing before leaving and picking up their children. I don't know what percentage that is across the board, but those were folks working in the prime of COVID. And there was not a single case from March the 20th through June the 12th, whatever that Friday was, of reopening. I think Jennifer has some information pulled from the website today in terms of the demographics of this.
Right, and you did cite that currently in Kentucky, the cases 0 to 9, I believe, are 556 in Kentucky as of 7/12. And I believe there was one death, and they said that was a SIDS complicated death. Senator Thomas, absolutely, we do not want to put a value, a number on anyone's illness or anyone's life. That is not what we're here to do. We also know we've had, however, many more flu deaths in this as well. And so I asked the question, how do we go on being able to care for children in a safe environment, in a safe way, best practice, giving them developmentally appropriate programming when we're all about to evaporate and not be here to be able to do that? Unless we have some miraculous funding that can continue to come through, because as you heard the cabinet say, they've exhausted that funding. And they did a beautiful job trying to get it out there quickly. They did a great job trying to figure out specific ways to be able to get that to us, whether it be for PPE and all of those things. But these things are running out. And those regs go till March of 2021 with the opportunity to be looked at. Well, if someone tells me I'm going to look at something, I kind of need a date of when that's going to be so that I can plan accordingly. But I don't know when that is. And it's been told it's going to be based on certain numbers. I don't know what that threshold is. Texas has 12,000 child care centers. Their numbers are based on 12,000 child care centers. Our numbers are based on 2,000 child care centers. So we want to keep that in mind too. So again, I don't value money over life ever. Ever. That's not what I'm here to say. It's not about a profit. It's about being here. My date to not be here is October.
Thank you. I'll remind members of the committee, we're running short on time. We do have a committee that's ready to go after our committee and needs this room. Do we have any other questions from members of the committee for this group? Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be brief. Mr. Stevenson, I heard you mention the word subsidy, and I was also in that committee with Representative Hale and Senator Thomas, and I just wanted to again clarify, because I understand that even though you were shut down, those facilities that had kids that were receiving assistance, and then some facilities don't have as many of those numbers of children, that the facilities that had assistance kids, that they continued to receive the subsidy even though the service wasn't being provided. Is that correct?
That's true, and the cabinet actually made an exception to pay based on full day enrollment versus attendance, which is the policy for CCAP. So yes, those facilities through July 15th, I believe, continue to receive enrollment-based funding from the Child Care Subsidy Program, which has been a great help to keep them open.
Okay, and then those children, if they were children of essential workers, and so they, in the meantime, because your facilities were closed, were being served in the limited duration centers, was that money following the child, or was it being double paid, or could you speak to that?
From my understanding, and the cabinet could probably speak to this better than me, I think they were paying two facilities, which I personally have no problem with. because there's the same need at both facilities. LDCs are operating with the need for funding in the same way that these other centers who were shut down were needing the funding. My understanding, they were paid at both. I personally, my opinion is I don't have a problem with that personally.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? This will have to be the final question if we have any for this group. Co-Chair Hale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on the testimony that has been presented here before us today and the information that we have been given, and please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think it is possible to amend a emergency regulation. Am I correct on that?
That's correct.
Okay, so not being able to amend an emergency regulation, I would like to make a motion to find this emergency regulation deficient based on primarily the testimony of the limited amount of individuals that are can only be in a facility. And so I would make that motion at this time, sir.
I would ask that you hold the motion.
Okay, I will do that, sir.
And I would ask that those who testified against would step back and that the cabinet would come forward.
I'm sorry if I was out of turn, sir.
That's okay. As I said earlier, we're running short on time, but if you could, 2 or 3 minutes to respond to the testimony against, if you would like.
From our end, these smaller group sizes were put in place to protect the health and safety of our children when they were in these confined areas with other children. We've talked about public school and the maximum capacity for those classrooms. Those children are much older and they have the ability to space themselves more. When we're talking about a room full of 18-month-old children, we want to make sure that we do what we can to spread the illness, to prevent the spread of the illness for children that may not be able to do that for themselves. And again, this idea is going to be fluid as we watch these numbers over the next few months. But the idea at this point was, as we've reopened initially, we want to make sure that children have the best possible chances to remain healthy and safe, along with the teachers who are just as critical in this time period. And then as the state finds ways to reduce the spread of the virus, we have the ability to withdraw an emergency reg, change numbers, move forward in those ideas in the future. But the reg was written in a way right now so that we can protect all the children and families that are within the program.
Thank you. Now, I believe Representative Hale, would you like to make that motion for deficiency?
Yes, sir, I would. And would you like me to state it again?
Please, if you could.
I would make a motion to find this emergency regulation that is before us today deficient based on the testimony that has been presented to us today.
So on the table, we have a motion for deficiency. Do we have a second of the motion for deficiency? Second from Senator Adams. I'm sorry, I didn't hear correctly. Representative Frazier makes a second. Any discussion on the motion for deficiency at this time? I would like to make a statement on this. I agree 100% with the motion. In my opinion, this is almost the poster child for a motion for deficiency under 13A 32.7. A subcommittee may make a motion for a determination of deficiency if the regulation appears to impose an unreasonable burden on government or small business or both. So in this situation, from testimony we've heard that 43% of these entities will go out of business if this regulation is allowed to stand. And not only is that detrimental to business, but I think that's also detrimental to Commonwealth. And let me preface my comments further by saying I understand the cabinet and the role you have to play in what you're trying to do. Once again, I realize that your intentions are in the right place and you're trying to do the right thing and keep people and children safe. But on the other hand, this Commonwealth could face economic collapse. Two reasons would be if children were not allowed to attend school or go back to daycare because the parents need that daycare so they can go back to work. The state is currently facing a $1 billion budget shortfall. Our $900 million in unemployment insurance has evaporated. We've just taken out a loan for $850 million. Unfortunately, I feel like we're in a catch-22 situation when it comes to this particular reg, because we have to find a way, we have to find the proper balance to protect health and safety, but at the same time, get people back to work in this state. And in my opinion, I trust that these daycare centers can do the job of keeping these kids safe and doing what they need to do that. So I speak in favor, that's my speech in favor of the motion for deficiency. Do we have any other discussion on the motion for deficiency? Representative Marcy.
I just have a question. So for the cabinet, y'all said that this is fluid, so if things should be great in the next month or so, could these be eased up?
We are prepared to withdraw the emergency regulation and file a new emergency regulation once it has been determined by those who make those decisions to do so.
Okay.
Hey, let me add something to that, Representative. That also is that there is the point of there is the restraining order that's in place. Right. So we will have to obviously keep that as a big part of where this goes from here.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Any other questions or discussion on the motion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Senator Rocky Adams. Senator Kerr. Senator Kerr, thank you. Senator Thomas.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to explain my no vote, please.
Please proceed.
Thank you. The last statement made was, what is the state facing? And I would submit that what the state of Kentucky is facing now is a continuing increase in the number of deaths among Kentuckians from this coronavirus. There is no question that Kentuckians and all Americans are tired of this coronavirus. But the reality, in fact, the harsh reality today is that this coronavirus is certainly not tired of facing us. And what we have here is our own Cabinet for Health and Family Services really trying to do all it can to protect, one of our most vulnerable populations, and that is, our infants and our youth. And I made the point today that as of July 3rd, you had about 450 10-year-olds and under that had contracted coronavirus. The testimony provided by some of the witnesses today was that number, as of July 12th, had gone up to 556. In fact, we've seen an increase of 100 of 10-year-olds and under contracted coronavirus just in the last 10 days. An increase of 100 10-year-olds and under contracted coronavirus in the last 10 days. And yet it appears that we're going to hold a regulation deficient that's trying to stem the tide of the contraction of an infection of coronavirus by those 10-year-olds and officially may pass. It probably will. But I want the record to show that I voted no on this because I believe that this regulation is deficient and that this state should always take measures to protect the infection and death of our young people. And so therefore, I am proud to vote no on this particular motion.
Representative Frazier?
I'd like to explain my yes vote.
Please proceed.
Yes, so Senator Thomas, I agree that we need to protect all children's lives. The reason that I'm voting yes today is because of the operation of the limited duration centers. They are operating, there are children that are being served under those regulations, and it's completely different than what's been set forth in this. So I would just like to see guidelines to be congruent, so we're taking care of and addressing this for the same for all children in all establishments.
Representative Hale?
Yes.
Representative Marzian? Representative Turner? Senator West?
Aye.
It takes 5 votes to pass in this committee, and we received 5 votes. The motion carries.
Motion carries. That concludes this meeting of the Administrative Regulation Review Committee. It's been a long one. And thank you all for your testimony today. Really appreciate it. Do we have any other business to come before this committee at this time? Senator Adams says no. Meeting's adjourned.